Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. By the way, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Feel free to share in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from you. And if this little moment of peace feels just right, tapping the like button or subscribing is a lovely way to let me know you like more moments like this. No pressure, of course, just if it feels right. Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. A fresh start, I told myself. Something new, somewhere quiet. But as I stood in front of the old house on Warren Street, clutching a heavy brass key in one hand and my phone in the other, doubt prickled the back of my neck. The house had character, the listing had said. A charming fixer-upper. Quaint, the real estate agent had called it as she rushed me through the paperwork. I remember the way she avoided looking me in the eye when she handed over the key, like she knew something she wasn't telling me. It was a 2-story house with peeling gray paint and windows that seemed to sag under their own weight. A single gnarled oak tree stood in the front yard, its bare branches clawing at the winter sky. The porch creaked ominously as I stepped onto it, the wood groaning beneath my weight. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, wincing as it let out a long, low creak. The smell hit me immediately, an earthy, musty scent, like damp wood in forgotten spaces. Dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through the grimy windows. The living room was to the right, sparsely furnished with a sagging couch and a wooden coffee table that looked like it had seen better decades. To the left was a narrow staircase leading to the second floor. The kitchen was straight ahead, its linoleum floor curling at the edges. I dropped my bag in the hallway and tried to ignore the unsettling silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was waiting for something. Home sweet home, I muttered, forcing a smile. The first few days passed uneventfully. I unpacked, cleaned, and settled into a routine. The creaking floorboards and groaning pipes didn't bother me too much. I chalked it up to the house's age. At night, I'd curl up on the couch with a book or scroll through my phone, the faint hum of the heater filling the empty space. It wasn't until the third night that things started to feel off. I was lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere below. At first, I thought it was the heater kicking on, but it didn't stop. It was deliberate, like footsteps, slow and heavy. I sat up, holding my breath. Hello. My voice sounded thin and small in the dark. The house responded with a soft creak, then silence. I convinced myself it was nothing, a loose shutter or the wind rattling the old walls. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I met Mrs. Keller, my neighbor from across the street. She was an older woman with a kind smile and eyes that darted around like she was always looking for something. "You're the new tenant, then?" she asked, her tone too casual. "That's me," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Figured I'd try something different. She nodded slowly, her smile faltering. "That house, it's been empty for a while. People don't stay long." "Why's that?" I asked, half joking. "It's not haunted, is it?" Mrs. Keller's face darkened. She glanced over my shoulder at the house, then back at me. "You just be careful. Some places have memories, and some memories don't like to be forgotten." I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. She gave me a small wave and shuffled back into her house, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They started in the hallway and moved slowly, deliberately, toward my bedroom door. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the blankets like they could protect me. The doorknob rattled. My breath hitched. I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open, but after a few agonizing seconds, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. In the morning, I told myself it had been a dream. Stress, maybe. Moving into a new place was always an adjustment. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't right with this house, and I was starting to think it knew I was here. By the time the sun set on the fourth day, I was exhausted. Sleep didn't come easy when every creak and groan of the house felt like a threat. My coffee intake doubled, my nerves frayed, and I started jumping at the sound of my own footsteps on the uneven floorboards. I tried to rationalize it all. Old houses made noises. It was part of their charm, right? But deep down, I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach every time the house went quiet, like it was holding its breath. That night, as I settled into the couch with a half-hearted attempt at watching a movie, a sudden noise startled me. A faint, scratching sound, like nails on wood, echoed through the living room. I muted the TV, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from the walls. I leaned forward, straining to listen. It started faintly, then grew louder, moving from one side of the room to the other. My mind raced for explanations. Mice? Rats? Something bigger? I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and crouched near the wall where the noise was loudest. I pressed my ear against the peeling wallpaper, and for a moment I heard nothing. Then, a faint whisper. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. A voice, soft, almost childlike, murmuring words I couldn't understand. I jerked back, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the house turned on. The next morning, I called an exterminator. The man who showed up was burly, with a no-nonsense demeanor that I found comforting. He inspected the house, tapping on walls and shining his flashlight into dark corners. "Doesn't look like you've got a pest problem," he said finally, shrugging. "No droppings, no nests. House is just old. It'll make noises. You'll get used to it." I nodded, forcing a smile. But as he packed up his gear and headed toward the door, I couldn't help myself. "Have you heard anything strange about this place?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. The man paused, his brow furrowing. "Strange, like what?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Never mind. Thanks for coming out." He nodded and left without another word. That evening, Mrs. Keller knocked on my door. She held a plate of cookies, her weathered hands trembling slightly. I invited her in, grateful for the company, though her eyes darted around nervously as she stepped inside. "I wanted to check on you," she said, settling onto the couch. "You looked a bit shaken this morning." I hesitated, debating whether to tell her, but something about her warm presence made me spill everything. The footsteps, the scratching, the whispers. Her expression darkened with every word. "You shouldn't ignore it," she said quietly when I finished. "That house, it has a way of keeping people. Sometimes, it doesn't like to let go." "What do you mean?" I asked, my mouth dry. She sighed, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "Years ago, the man who lived here was different, obsessed with strange things, books about the occult, symbols carved into the walls. People in the neighborhood used to hear chanting at night. And then, one day, he was just gone. Gone." I echoed. "Vanished," she said. "The police found no sign of him. His things were still here, his car in the driveway. It's like he walked out of the house and disappeared into thin air." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "And you think what?" "That he's still here." Mrs. Keller didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pendant on a thin chain. It was an odd, intricate design, almost like a star, but not quite. She pressed it into my hand. "Keep this with you," she said. "It might help." "Help with what?" I asked, but she was already on her feet, heading toward the door. Before she left, she turned back to me, her face pale. "Don't go looking for answers," she said. "Some things are better left alone." That night, I placed a pendant on my nightstand and crawled into bed, hoping for a dreamless sleep. But the house had other plans. The whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to echo from every corner of the room, overlapping and indistinct. I pressed the pillow over my ears, but it didn't help. The air grew colder, biting against my skin. And then, for the first time, I heard my name. It was soft, almost a sigh, but unmistakable. My blood turned to ice as I sat up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached for the pendant, clutching it tightly in my hand. The room fell silent, but the cold lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to know what was happening in this house. What had happened to the man who disappeared, and why I felt like something was watching me. But as I stared at the cracks in the walls and the shadows pooling in the corners, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might not like the answers. I couldn't stop thinking about the house's past. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark corners of the rooms, the peeling wallpaper, and heard those whispers. The house was alive in a way I couldn't explain, as though it knew my every movement, my every thought. I decided I had to know more. That afternoon, I went into the attic. I'd been avoiding it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. There had to be something up there. Some clue, some explanation for the strange happenings. Mrs. Keller had warned me not to look for answers, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt like I was suffocating in the unknown. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the attic door. I hesitated before opening it, but the pull was too strong. The door groaned on its hinges, revealing a dim, dusty room filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air smelled like forgotten memories, mothballs and dry wood. I moved cautiously, flashlight in hand, scanning the room. The shelves were lined with boxes, old trunks, and bags of what looked like old clothes. But there was something else, a large wooden chest at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. My heart pounded as I approached the chest. The wood was worn, darkened with age, and covered in a layer of dust. The latch was rusted, but after a few tugs, it gave way. I lifted the lid with a creak, my flashlight illuminating the contents. Inside, I found a journal. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. It felt heavy in my hands, like it carried the weight of something old, something dangerous. I opened it carefully, the pages stiff and fragile. The handwriting inside was messy, scrawled with urgency. It looked like a man's sharp, jagged letters that seemed to bleed onto the page. The first entry was dated years ago, more than 20. The words jumped out at me. It's been months since I first found the book. It called to me in the night. The whispers, the shadows, they're getting closer. The rituals are working. I can feel them. Feel the other side pressing against the walls of this house. But I must be careful. I don't know what I've unlocked, but I can't stop now. I turned the page, my stomach tightening as I read on. The entries grew more erratic, the words slanting diagonally across the pages as if written in a frantic rush. The man described strange occurrences, voices in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, objects that would disappear and reappear. And in every entry, he mentioned something about opening the door. Tonight, I tried it. The circle is complete. I performed the ritual, and for the first time, I felt it. Something stirring in the air, something waiting on the other side. It spoke to me. I can't write the words, but it promises power. It promises freedom. If I can just get closer. My fingers trembled as I turned the page. The next few entries were fragmented, the writing barely legible. He spoke of terrible dreams, of being hunted by something that wasn't human. The last entry was written hastily. The ink smudged as if the man had written it in fear. It's too late. It's here. I tried to close the door, but it won't let me. It's inside me. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't stay. The house will never let you go. I dropped the journal like it was burning hot. It felt as though the room had grown colder, the air thick with the weight of the man's final words. The whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving just out of the corner of my eye. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that the house was really cursed, that something dark had been let loose here long ago. But the evidence was undeniable. The man's obsession with whatever had been opened and the way his words had slowly descended into madness. I closed the chest and shoved it back into place, my hands shaking. My breath felt shallow, like I was suffocating. I had to get out of the attic. I had to get out of this house. But when I turned to leave, I heard something, a soft, muffled thud from somewhere below, followed by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. I crept down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps grew louder as I descended, as if someone, was walking just a few steps behind me. I could feel its presence, the heavy weight of it, close enough that I could almost hear its breath. I made it to the first floor and stopped, holding my breath. The house was still. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath, too. A cold breeze brushed past me, and I turned, my eyes scanning the dark hallway. I was certain I had seen something. A figure standing at the end of the hall, its outline blurred in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed away, my pulse racing. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air as I stood on the cracked porch. The house loomed behind me, silent for the moment, but I could still feel it watching me, waiting for me to come back. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The whispers carried on the wind, and this time, they weren't speaking to me. They were speaking to whoever might come next. The air outside was cold, biting against my skin as I stood there on the porch, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The footsteps, the whispers, the shadows moving through the house. It all felt so real, so immediate, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just a figment of my imagination. I didn't want to go back inside. I didn't want to step foot in that house again, but I couldn't leave, not without knowing for sure, not without confronting whatever was haunting me. I glanced at the key in my hand, the heavy brass object that had started all of this. The house had chosen me, or perhaps it had simply waited for someone weak enough to accept its invitation. I was shaking, but I forced myself to turn around. I had to know what was happening in there, what had been unleashed. The door swung open with a loud groan as I stepped back into the house, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something foul like rotting wood and decay. The house felt heavier now, like the walls were closing in on me. I stood in the hallway, breathing deeply, trying to calm myself. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, its presence suffocating. The whispers had faded for the moment, but I knew they were waiting, lurking in the dark corners. I made my way to the living room, my eyes scanning every shadow. The furniture was still as I had left it, but everything felt off. The walls seemed closer somehow, the air colder. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, sitting in the middle of the floor, was the journal, the one I had hidden away in the attic. I hadn't left it there. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible. I had locked the chest. There was no way it could have gotten here on its own. The whispers started again, low at first, then rising in volume as if they were drawing closer. I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, my mind racing. It was happening again. The house was trapping me. A cold wind blew through the room, swirling around me like an unseen force. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, but it didn't help. The chill sunk deep into my bones. The room seemed to pulse, and for a moment, the walls seemed to stretch and bend, warping before my eyes. I blinked, trying to focus, but everything was shifting, like the house was alive, breathing, moving around me. And then I heard it, a voice, low, raspy, like something was speaking through the walls. Leave. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a command, a warning. I turned toward the source of the voice, but all I saw was the empty room, the furniture, the dark shadows hanging in the corners. I ran for the door again, my heart thumping in my chest, but when I reached for the handle, I found it locked. The key I had used earlier was gone. The whispers turned to laughter. I turned in a panic, searching the room for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. The old mirror, hanging on the far wall. It was large, ornate, framed in dark wood. But instead of reflecting the room, it reflected something else. A figure. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. But there was something wrong about it. Its face was twisted, its eyes hollow and empty. It smiled at me, a smile that didn't belong to a human. I staggered backward, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the mirror moved, its head tilting slightly as it stared at me. "Help me," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of my own. I screamed, backing away until I hit the wall. The laughter in the room grew louder, more frantic, as the figure in the mirror grinned wider. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The mirror returned to normal, reflecting only the empty room behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Whatever was in this house, it wanted me. It wanted to keep me here. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I rushed to the door again, the panic surging through my chest. I yanked on the handle, praying it would give. But this time it opened. I stepped outside, the cold air slapping my face, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop running until I was far enough from the house that I could no longer hear its whispers, its calls. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, following me. I looked back, but the house was empty, silent, still, waiting. I didn't go back inside, but as I walked away, I could swear I heard the faintest sound carried on the wind, a laugh. It's strange how quickly fear can become a habit. I thought that if I left, if I simply walked away from the house, the nightmare would end. But the further I got from it, the more I realized I was never really free. I stayed at a motel for the next few nights, the only refuge I could find. But sleep never came easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection in the mirror, the twisted face, the smile that didn't belong to anyone. I tried to put it out of my mind, to live a normal life. I even started going to work again, though my focus was fractured. It was hard to concentrate with the constant pressure on my chest, like something unseen was watching, waiting. I felt it everywhere, on the bus, in the grocery store, even in the quiet of my apartment. One evening, as I sat in my car outside the motel, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I noticed something strange. The air had grown thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that made you feel like you were being suffocated. I turned my head and looked back toward the direction of the house. The house was there, of course. It always was. But this time, there was something different. It was as though it were glowing faintly, just enough to make the edges of the house seem unreal. Something was moving around the windows, shadows flitting past the glass as if someone or something was inside. I felt my stomach twist, my breath shallow. I should have ignored it. I should have driven away. But instead, I found my hands turning the key in the ignition, the car rolling slowly toward the house. The closer I got, the stronger the pull. It was like an invisible hand, tugging at me, urging me to come closer, to go back. I couldn't stop myself. I parked at the edge of the yard, my eyes drawn to the house. It was quiet now, still, but I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me. The whispers that had followed me all this time seemed to rise, but this time, they weren't in my head. They were real. The door of the house creaked open. I didn't know why I walked inside. Maybe it was the fear. Maybe it was the need for answers. But as I stepped into the hallway, the air was thick with the same foul scent I had smelled before. My heart hammered in my chest as I glanced down the corridor. It looked like nothing had changed. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I moved through the house, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But the silence in the air was suffocating, thick with a presence I couldn't escape. Then I heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass, coming from the living room. I froze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as though someone was trying to get my attention. It was coming from the direction of the mirror, the one in the living room. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to see that thing again, the thing that wasn't me but wore my face. But my body moved on its own, drawn by the noise, drawn by something I couldn't understand. As I entered the room, my eyes immediately went to the mirror. It was reflecting the room, just like it always had. But this time, the reflection was different. In the mirror, the room was darker, as if the shadows had deepened and spread. The furniture was pushed to the sides, the center of the room empty except for one thing. A figure stood before the mirror. It was me, or at least, it looked like me, but there was something wrong about the way it moved, something unnatural in the way it swayed. It was smiling. It wasn't just a reflection of my face. It was me. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. I watched as my reflection reached toward the glass, its hand pressing against it, distorting the surface, like something was trying to break through. My own reflection smiled wider, its face twisting into something grotesque. That's when I realized it wasn't a reflection at all. It was a doorway. The thought hit me like a wave, and before I could think, my hand reached out, brushing the surface of the mirror. The moment I touched it, I felt it cold, sharp, as though my hand had slipped into another world. My skin burned with a freezing chill, and the glass rippled like water, the distorted face on the other side pressing forward. I pulled back, stumbling away, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand, a real hand, pale and thin, was reaching out from the mirror, its fingers stretching toward me. I screamed and backed away, but the hand followed, crawling along the surface of the glass. I felt a cold breath against my neck, like something was right behind me. The house shook, the walls groaning as though they were alive. The whispers were deafening now, all around me, rising to a crescendo. Leave, leave now, before it's too late. I turned and ran, the house seeming to stretch and bend as I tried to find the door. It was impossible to focus, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching for me. I reached the front door and flung it open, barely catching my breath as I stepped outside, gasping for air. But the moment I looked back, I knew I was still trapped. The house was standing there, silent once more, but I could still hear the whispers. And this time, they weren't in my head. They were coming from inside the house. They were calling me back. And I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. I couldn't go back inside. I couldn't do it. But as the whispers followed me, always just out of reach, I knew it wasn't over. The house was not finished with me. It wouldn't let me go. The image of that hand, reaching from the mirror, burned in my mind. The coldness of it, the way it almost felt real. I didn't know where to go. The motel felt too close to the house, like a thin veil between the horror I had just experienced and the world I had once known. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, saw that hand, the thing on the other side. I spent the night driving, around and around in circles, not knowing where I was going but unable to stop. The roads blurred as I lost myself in the headlights, the soft hum of the tires against the asphalt, the occasional flicker of a streetlight. I don't know how long I was gone, but by the time I returned to the house, the sun was just starting to set. The sky was painted in dark purples and fiery oranges, the last light of the day sinking beneath the horizon. The house stood before me, dark and foreboding, its windows like hollow eyes staring into my soul. I had to go inside, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have a choice anymore. Something in me was already halfway through the door before my mind had even caught up. I wasn't sure if it was the house pulling me in or if it was just my own madness taking control, but there was no stopping it. The door opened with a creak that echoed through the empty halls, and I stepped inside once more. This time, I didn't feel the overwhelming weight of the house pressing on me, but I felt something else. A cold, oppressive silence. The whispers had gone quiet, but I knew they were still here, watching, waiting. The living room seemed different now. The furniture was arranged in a way that felt unfamiliar, like it had been moved without my notice. The air was thick, like a storm had settled inside the house, the walls nearly vibrating with tension. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but the pull to investigate was unbearable. I walked down the hallway, past the stairs leading up to the second floor, until I came to the door at the end of the hall. It was the one I hadn't dared to open before, the door that seemed to be sealed shut by something invisible, something powerful. This time, I reached for the handle without hesitation. It turned easily under my hand, the door swinging open with a soft groan. Inside was a small room, barely furnished. The walls were bare except for old, faded paintings. I couldn't make out the faces in the paintings, but the way they seemed to watch me made my skin crawl. In the center of the room was an altar. It was made of stone, worn smooth by time, with symbols carved into its surface. The air around it felt different, thicker, colder. My heart began to race again, the sensation of something watching me, waiting for me to do something, to take the next step. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. A book, a large old tome, sitting on the altar like it was waiting for me. I couldn't resist. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The cover was dark, almost black, with no title, no indication of what it was. As I opened it, I was struck by the first page, a single phrase written in an unfamiliar language. The door opens and the shadows step through. I turned the page and the words blurred. I couldn't make sense of them. They didn't look like anything I had ever seen. But the feeling, the overwhelming feeling that surged through me, was unmistakable. I had to keep reading. The next few pages were filled with descriptions of rituals, symbols, and incantations. I didn't understand them, but there was one that caught my eye, a drawing, an illustration of the house, with a dark shape hovering above it. The shape was familiar, like a shadow stretched across time. It was the same thing that had been in the mirror, the thing that had reached through the glass. The text next to it read, "It waits. It always waits. It cannot cross unless the door is open from both sides." My stomach churned. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The door, the mirror, it wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, a gateway to something dark, something that had been sealed away for years, something that had been waiting for the right moment to cross over. I closed the book, my hands shaking, and looked around the room. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something ancient and wrong. It wasn't just the house that was alive. It was whatever had been trapped here, whatever had been waiting to get out. The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, my heart racing, and froze. The room was darker now, the shadows deeper. And in the center of the room, standing where the altar had been, was a figure, a shadow, its shape indistinct but growing, stretching taller, darker. It didn't move. It didn't have to. I could feel it. I could feel its presence, pressing in on me from all sides. My legs felt weak, my chest tight, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my eyes from it. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to, but I heard the voice, clear in my mind. You should have stayed away. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped in the room with it. The shadow stepped forward. The figure's presence was suffocating. Its shadow stretched across the room like a dark fog, thick and all-encompassing, drawing closer with every breath I took. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs were stiff, unyielding, and the more I struggled, the more the weight of the air pressed down on me. The room grew colder with each passing second, an unnatural chill creeping through my skin, settling deep into my bones. My breath came out in visible puffs, sharp and ragged in the stillness of the room. The figure before me didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. You shouldn't have come back, the voice whispered again. It was soft, like a breath in my ear, but it reverberated in my skull, drowning out everything else. I tried to force my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry, my words stuck behind my teeth. I felt my pulse in my ears, deafening, drowning. Who are you? I finally managed to ask, my voice weak and shaky. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the figure shifted. It was a subtle movement, a flicker, but enough to make the room feel as if it were warping, bending in on itself. The shadows deepened, pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare. I am the door, the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper but a low, guttural growl. I am the one that waits. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and I could feel something ancient stirring. It wasn't just in the room with me anymore. It was inside me, clawing at the edges of my mind, invading every thought. It didn't make sense. None of this did. But I had seen the book. I had seen the symbols, the drawings. I had opened the door without realizing it. And now, whatever was on the other side was here with me. I was not alone. Leave, it growled, its form shifting like smoke, expanding, contracting, becoming more and less at the same time. Leave this place and never return. I shook my head, trying to break free of its grasp, but the more I struggled, the tighter the grip became. The air around me grew impossibly thick, choking me. My heart pounded in my chest, faster and faster, as though I were about to collapse under its weight. No, I gasped, barely able to form the words. I can't. The figure shifted again, and this time, its form was clearer. It was no longer just a shadow, but something darker, more solid, more defined. I could see a face now, though it was distorted. Its features a twisted blend of shadow and something more sinister. Its eyes were black, endless, like two pits of pure darkness. The same emptiness that had been in the reflection, in the mirror. You cannot escape me, it said, its voice dripping with malice. You are already part of me. The door has opened. You crossed it willingly. The word struck me like a blow. I thought back to the journal, to the warnings in the book, to the whispers that had followed me. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something much worse. The door hadn't just opened for me. It had opened for it. Suddenly, I was on my knees, the force of the thing's presence too overwhelming to resist. My breath was ragged now, coming in shallow gasps, and I could feel the coldness of the room seep into my very soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. But then, through the darkness, I saw something. A flicker, like a crack in the air, a sliver of light breaking through the crushing shadow. It was a door, the same door I had walked through before, the light from the outside world. My way out? I wasn't sure how, but in that moment of clarity, something deep inside me snapped. With every ounce of strength left in my body, I forced myself to stand, to move, to break free from the paralyzing grip of the shadow. The figure before me let out a low, furious growl, but it wasn't enough to stop me. I ran. My legs were heavy, my movements clumsy, but I pushed through the terror, the suffocating air, the growing darkness. I could hear the figure's voice in my head, whispering curses, threatening me, but I ignored it. I didn't care anymore. I reached the door. It was still open. The world beyond the threshold was the same as it had been before. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, but I could already feel the weight lifting off me, the pressure receding as I stepped outside. The house was behind me now, but the air still felt wrong. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. I could still hear the whispers, distant but persistent, as though the house was calling me back, as though the thing in there was still watching me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs ached, until my lungs burned with the effort. The house was nothing but a silhouette in the distance, growing smaller with every step. But still, I felt it, the pull, the weight of it. I didn't know how far I had run, but when I finally stopped, breathless and exhausted, I found myself standing on the edge of a small town. I hadn't even realized I had come this far, but the house, it was still there. I could feel it, and I knew that it would never let me go. I spent the next few days trying to piece my life back together, though it felt like trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. I moved into a new place in the town, a small apartment that felt too quiet, too ordinary. There were no creaking floorboards, no dark corners where shadows seemed to move on their own. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, as though the thing in that house might follow me here, might find its way into this place too. The weight of it, the darkness that had tried to swallow me whole, lingered, hanging over me like a storm cloud that refused to break. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house again, the figure, its dark form watching me from the corners of my vision. Every noise in the apartment, every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, made my heart race with panic. It didn't help that the nightmares had started. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the air in the room thick with the same suffocating darkness that had filled the house. The figure would be there, standing in the doorway, or worse, right beside my bed. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, its eyes boring into me, and I could hear the whispers, softer now, but still there. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just fear, just the lingering effects of what I had gone through. But then I began to notice something. The whispers weren't just in my dreams. They were there, in the quiet moments when I was awake, when I was alone. It wasn't until I started hearing the whispers at work that I knew something was wrong. I'd be sitting at my desk, trying to focus on the task at hand, when a voice would drift through my mind, low, insistent, and all too familiar. Come back. I shook it off at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but then it happened again, and again, each time clearer, more urgent. Come back, or it will never stop. I didn't know what it meant, but I was afraid to find out. The whispers grew louder, and then one evening, as I sat in my apartment, trying to drown them out with music, I heard a knock at the door. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. No one ever came to visit me. I didn't have any friends here, not yet. I got up slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't anyone I knew. When I opened it, there was no one there, just an empty hallway, dimly lit, the same quiet hum of the building. But then, on the ground, just beneath the door, I saw it. A piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up, my hand trembling. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and crinkled as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. I turned it over. On it, in jagged, almost frantic handwriting, were the words, "It is not over. It follows. You must finish what you started." I stared at the words, my mind spinning. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the journal I had found in the house. The same frantic scrawl, the same desperate warnings. I thought about burning it, throwing it away, anything to rid myself of it. But I couldn't. I was already too far gone. The whispers had followed me. The shadows had followed me, and there was no escaping them. I knew I had to go back. I had to finish what I had started, whatever that meant. The house still had its grip on me, and there was only one way to break free. I wasn't sure what I would find when I went back, whether I'd face the same thing that had haunted me before or if something darker had come through the door. But I knew I couldn't leave it unfinished. Not now. Not when the consequences seemed to stretch far beyond me. So I packed a bag, gathered what little I had, and drove back to that place. The house. The one that had been calling me all this time. The drive was long. The miles stretched out ahead of me, each one feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. I tried to focus on the road, on the hum of the tires against the asphalt, but all I could think about was the house, the dark thing inside, the whispers that had followed me all this time. As I neared the town, I could feel the weight of the house drawing me in, like a magnet pulling on my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I didn't dare let go. I was already too far down this road, already too close to turning back. The house came into view as I rounded the final bend. There it stood, just as it had before, old, weathered, but unchanged. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes staring into the distance. It looked peaceful from a distance, almost welcoming. But I knew better. I parked across the street, the engine's hum dying as I turned it off. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the house. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to drive away, to never step foot on that property again. But I couldn't, not after everything that had happened, not after what I had learned. I grabbed the bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, my feet heavy on the ground as I walked toward the house. My heart pounded in my chest, each step echoing louder than the last. The front door was unlocked. It wasn't a surprise. It never was. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and decay immediately hitting my nostrils. The house felt colder this time, like it was waiting for me. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, but the whispers, those were gone. For now, at least. I walked down the hallway, past the old wallpaper that was peeling in places, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I didn't look back. I knew that whatever was here, whatever had been calling me, wasn't behind me. It was ahead, waiting. I made my way to the room at the end of the hall. The room I had avoided the last time I was here. The one with the altar. The one that had seemed to hold the key to everything. The door creaked open, and the familiar chill swept over me. The room was the same as it had been, but something was different now. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, more alive. The altar stood in the center of the room, the symbols carved into its surface glowing faintly, as if they were pulsing with some unseen energy. The book from before was still there, open, as though it had been waiting for me. I approached the altar cautiously, my fingers brushing the pages of the book. The language was still strange, but it didn't matter anymore. I could feel it, feel the power thrumming in the air around me. The house had a heartbeat. It was alive. I turned the pages, searching for something, anything that might explain what I had to do. My eyes caught on a drawing, another one of the house, but this time there was something different. In the picture, The house was surrounded by darkness, a shadow that seemed to pour out of every window and crack. The figure, the thing I had seen before, was standing in the center, its form clearer than it had ever been, and beneath the image there was a single line of text. To close the door, the price must be paid. I didn't understand. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I couldn't stop reading. I needed to know what to do, how to end this. The next page was blank. I flipped through the rest of the book. Nothing. It was empty. I slammed the book shut, a wave of frustration and terror crashing over me. What did it mean? What was the price? How was I supposed to stop this? I stood there, frozen, my mind racing, when I heard it. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the stairs above. My breath caught in my throat. I turned toward the door, but before I could move, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It moved across the room, too fast, too fluid to be real. But it was. I could feel it. I turned back to the altar, desperation clawing at my throat. The whispers had returned, louder now, more insistent. The price must be paid. I didn't know what they meant. I didn't know what I had to do. But I knew one thing. Whatever was coming down those stairs, I wasn't going to face it unprepared. I grabbed the journal from the altar and ran from the room, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps were getting closer, and the shadows, those dark, stretching shapes, seemed to be following me, crawling across the walls, moving with me. I ran down the hall, down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I stopped at the front door. It wouldn't open. I yanked at the knob, panic surging through me as I pulled with all my strength. But the door was locked. It was always locked. I turned back, facing the darkness of the house. It was too late to escape. The air in the house grew thicker, almost suffocating. I could feel it pressing in on me, the darkness closing around me like a vice. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The footsteps, those heavy, deliberate steps, were drawing closer, and I could feel their weight in the pit of my stomach. I scrambled for the door, my fingers slipping against the old brass knob as I pulled, pushed, and twisted with frantic energy. But it wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself was holding it shut, keeping me inside, trapping me with whatever was coming. The whispers grew louder now, almost deafening. The voice from the room upstairs, that voice that had been calling me, was joined by others. They echoed off the walls, filling my head, drowning out everything else. The price must be paid. I turned toward the hallway. The figure was there now, standing at the top of the stairs, its form more solid, more defined than before. It was taller now, looming over me, its eyes dark pits of emptiness. It didn't move, but its presence was enough to make the air grow colder, to make my skin prickle with dread. I stepped back, my body moving on instinct, but the door was still locked, and the figure was drawing closer. I had no choice. I had to face it. I turned toward the hallway, hoping for a way out, but the house had changed. The walls seemed to shift, to bend, as though the space itself was warping in response to the presence of the things standing above me. The doors and windows blurred, the corners of the rooms darkening, like a black fog crawling along the floor. The whispers swirled around me, louder now, sharper. The words had changed, and I could hear them clearly now. To escape, you must give. The door is open. You are the key. I couldn't understand. What did they mean? How was I supposed to escape? I didn't have the answers. I was drowning in the darkness, suffocating under the weight of it all. The figure moved then, slowly, deliberately, its head tilted, and I could see the outline of its face, the twisted, contorted features that weren't quite human, a grotesque mockery of something living, something that had once been. Its eyes, those dark pits, stared into mine, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. freezing me in place. "You opened the door," it said, its voice low and guttural. "And now you will pay." The shadows around me thickened, swirling, enveloping me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I felt as though I were being drawn into the darkness, pulled into the very fabric of the house itself. But then, in that moment of utter helplessness, I saw something. Something flickering at the edge of my vision. A light. It was faint at first, barely visible, but it was there, coming from the door, the front door. It was glowing, a soft, steady light, like a beacon in the dark. The whispers stopped. The air seemed to still. The figure's eyes shifted, its attention momentarily broken. I ran. I didn't know how, but in that moment, the door was open. The light was brighter now, pulling me toward it. I dashed for it, the figure's growl echoing behind me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I reached the door. The cold was gone. The darkness had receded. But when I stepped outside, the light was gone. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty space. I was outside the house. I had escaped. I stood there, panting, trying to catch my breath, but the relief I should have felt didn't come. Instead, a cold knot of dread settled in my stomach. The house was still there, looming behind me, its windows dark and lifeless. I could still hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't over. I could feel it deep in my bones. The house wasn't finished with me. It was waiting, and it wasn't just the house. The thing, the shadow, the figure, it was still out there. I could feel its presence. Even now, just beyond the edge of the yard, just beyond the shadows. It had followed me. It would always follow me. But there was one thing I knew now. I couldn't escape. Not really. I wasn't free. I looked up at the sky, the sun beginning to set. The light was fading, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before the door would call me back again. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the house. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only minutes. The sky had grown darker, the last rays of the sun slipping away behind the trees, and a heavy quiet had settled over the town. The whispers were still there, drifting in and out of my mind, like a faint hum, a lullaby from another world. I wanted to run, to leave this place behind for good, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. That terrible, insistent feeling that I wasn't safe, that the darkness had only begun to spread, refused to leave me. I turned away from the house and walked down the road, my steps slow and unsteady. The town was quiet, far too quiet for comfort. The houses were empty, darkened windows staring at me like hollow eyes. It was as if the whole town had turned its back on me, or maybe the town had always been empty, and I had just never noticed. The shadows seemed to stretch longer with each step I took, crawling across the pavement, curling at my feet. I reached my car and got in, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where was safe anymore. I thought of driving far away, leaving the town, leaving everything behind. But then I remembered the house, the door, the price that had been paid. Whatever I had done, whatever had been opened, I knew it hadn't ended. The house still had its hold on me, its grip tightening with every passing second. As I started the car, the engine sputtered to life, but the headlights flickered and dimmed. I glanced into the rearview mirror, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the middle of the road behind me. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, the sound of the tires screeching against the pavement filling the night air. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the certainty that something was following me, was overwhelming. I drove for what felt like hours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being pulled back, that I was still trapped. The whispers never stopped. The figure never stopped watching. Eventually, I found myself driving through unfamiliar streets, unsure of where I was anymore. The landscape had shifted. The houses now strange, the buildings unfamiliar. It felt as though I had crossed some invisible line, a boundary that once kept the darkness at bay. That's when I saw it. The house. It stood at the end of the street, just as I remembered it. The same peeling paint, the same dark windows, the same door. It was the same, but it wasn't. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the street. I stared at the house, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. How was it possible? I had just left it behind. It had been miles away. I looked at the road ahead, but there was no turning back. I had driven in circles, coming back to the same place. The house was there, waiting for me, as though it had always been waiting. And then I heard the whisper again, clearer this time. It was more than just a voice in my head. It was real. It was coming from somewhere, just outside the car. You cannot escape. The door is open. You are the key. I turned, looking over my shoulder, and there it was, the figure. It was standing just beyond the car, its dark eyes staring at me through the windshield. I could feel the cold emanating from it, the suffocating weight of its presence. The air was thick with it. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was something else, something far darker, a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly, reaching toward me with cold, invisible hands. The engine sputtered again, the lights flickering one last time before going out completely. And that's when I knew. The house hadn't just been calling me. It had been pulling me back all along. I had never really left. The price had already been paid. Story 2. When I signed the lease, the landlord's grin was too wide, and his handshake lingered a second longer than it should have. But I told myself I was overthinking it. The house, despite its creaking bones and peeling paint, was cheap, and cheap was what I needed. Recently divorced, broke, and eager to start fresh, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. Moving day was uneventful. I arrived with a U-Haul full of mismatched furniture, boxes of books, and a cat named Beans. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people left their blinds drawn and their lawns overgrown. It suited me. I wasn't in the mood for nosy neighbors or friendly block parties. The house itself was old, Victorian style, with tall windows and a sagging porch. Inside, the wooden floors groaned underfoot, and the air carried a faint, musty smell that clung to my clothes. The kind of smell you couldn't quite scrub out. The previous tenant had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a rickety dining table, a dusty mirror in the hallway, and a grandfather clock that didn't work but still ticked faintly. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. Beans explored every nook and cranny, his tail puffing up whenever the floor creaked unexpectedly. The house had quirks, strange drafts, doors that didn't close properly, and a peculiar sound in the walls, like scratching or scuttling. Mice, I told myself. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate. My heart leapt into my throat, but I quickly remembered the attic. I hadn't checked it yet. Probably an animal, I thought. Raccoons or squirrels. I pulled the blanket tighter and drifted off to sleep, convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning, I stood on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, taking in the quiet street. The air smelled of damp leaves, and the neighborhood was still except for the occasional hum of a passing car. As I sipped, a figure shuffled into view, crossing the street toward me. She was an older woman, short and wiry, with a mess of gray hair pulled into a loose bun. Her cardigan hung lopsided over her thin frame, and her eyes were sharp and assessing. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, resting her hand on the railing. "Morning," she said, her voice raspy, as if she'd been yelling at the wind. "Morning," I replied, forcing a polite smile. She squinted at me like she was trying to figure out if I was a lost tourist or a new neighbor. "You're the one who moved into the old Mortimer place, huh?" I nodded. "That's me." Her expression darkened. "Well, I'm Mrs. Abernathy." Lived across the street for 30 years. Seen a lot of folks come and go from that house. Not many stay long. Her words pricked at me, but I kept my tone casual. Why's that? She glanced at the house, her lips pressing into a thin line. People say it's cursed. I let out a short laugh, but her expression didn't waver. Curse. Strange things happen here. Footsteps when no one's home. Doors slamming in the night. The kind of things that make folks uneasy. She paused, studying me. Last tenant ran out in the middle of the night. Didn't even bother to pack. Just left. That's unsettling, I said, though I tried to keep my voice light. Mrs. Abernathy nodded solemnly. There's talk about the Mortimers, the ones who built this place, especially old Elijah. Elijah? Her voice dropped. Man was obsessed with the occult. You ever hear about people trying to open doors that shouldn't be opened? I blinked, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything, she straightened up, brushing invisible dust off her cardigan. Just thought you should know. Some folks like their peace disturbed. Others, well, they regret it. Take care. She turned and shuffled back across the street, leaving me standing there with a cold mug of coffee and a knot in my stomach. That evening, as I unpacked a box of kitchen utensils, I couldn't shake Mrs. Abernathy's words. I chalked it up to local gossip. Every small town had its haunted house stories. But still, the house felt different. When I went to bed that night, Beans curled up on the windowsill instead of beside me. As I drifted off, I heard the faint sound of scratching. It came from inside the walls, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging against wood. I told myself it was mice. It had to be. But when I went to check the traps the next morning, they were empty. The days drifted by, and I began to get used to the house's quirks. There were moments when I felt like I was getting comfortable, like I might just be able to build a new life here. The house wasn't perfect, but neither was I. We seemed to understand each other. I made a routine for myself. Work during the day, unpacking in the evenings, and when the nights grew too quiet, I'd watch a few shows or read until sleep took over. The house, with its ancient creaks and groans, became just another part of the background noise. Still, there was always something off. Beans, who had been a bundle of energy during our first day, was now increasingly reclusive. He would stare at nothing, just sit in the corners of rooms, his eyes fixed on empty spaces, as if he was tracking something I couldn't see. Sometimes, I'd find him staring at the ceiling, his tail twitching like he was following something overhead. I laughed it off. Maybe it was a change in environment. Maybe he was just adjusting like me. But then, there were the nights. At first, it was easy to ignore the oddities. The sounds that didn't quite fit, the way the walls felt too cold at night, the soft but unmistakable scraping noises in the ceiling. It could have been a raccoon, right? Or some old pipe settling. But after a few weeks, it became harder to dismiss. One night, as I lay in bed reading, I heard a heavy footstep. Not the kind of sound made by a house settling or the wind shaking a loose beam, but deliberate, slow, as if someone was pacing just above me. I froze listening. Then, another step, and another. I sat up in bed, trying to steady my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be someone upstairs. There was no upstairs, just the attic. I hadn't dared to go up there, not since the door had slammed shut on me. I grabbed my phone and shone the flashlight up the stairwell, scanning the dark hallway above. The beams of light caught nothing but shadows, and the sound of my own breath felt too loud in the silence. I called out, "Hello." Nothing. I waited, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, slow and heavy, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. I got out of bed, my heart hammering. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the room ticked loudly, though it wasn't supposed to work. The sound seemed to mock me, like the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to do something, anything, that would make it real. I walked out into the hallway, my bare feet cold on the wooden floors. Beans was nowhere to be found. His absence made my skin crawl. I crept toward the attic door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The handle felt cold under my fingers, though it slick with the same chill that had crept through the walls in the night. Just check it, I told myself. There's nothing up there. It's just a house. It's just a house. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic was dark, but the flashlight on my phone flickered to life, casting long shadows across the space. Dust particles swirled in the beam of light. There was nothing unusual, just old furniture covered in dusty sheets, broken picture frames, and old crates stacked in corners. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I stepped into the room, my heart in my throat. It was quiet now, too quiet. The footsteps above had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, scanning the corners of the room, and that's when I saw it, a glint, underneath an old sheet. Something was reflecting the light. I lifted the corner of the fabric carefully, revealing a small, leather-bound journal. I picked it up, the cover cracked and faded with age. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged in places. As I flipped through it, my fingers trembling, I began to read the strange, rambling entries. The journal belonged to someone named Elijah Mortimer, the original owner of the house. The further I read, the more disturbed I became. The entries spoke of rituals, of doors to places that should not be opened, of whispers in the walls. One entry, in particular, caught my eye. The voices grow louder. I feel them pulling me. The house is hungry, but I will open the door. I will call to them, and they will answer. My pulse raced as I closed the book with a sharp snap. This wasn't just superstition. Elijah Mortimer had been obsessed with something dark. I needed to know more, but a part of me was already certain I wasn't going to like the answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. It wasn't just the footsteps or the strange noises anymore. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it were pressing in on me. The house was no longer just a place I was living in. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. Beans had started avoiding me altogether. For days, he wouldn't come near me, not even for food. I'd find him crouched in the hallway, his body tense and his eyes wide, staring at nothing. It was unsettling. His behavior made me feel like I wasn't alone in the house. One afternoon, I decided to take a break from unpacking. I sat by the window, staring out at the overgrown front yard, when I noticed something odd, movement across the street. Mrs. Abernathy was outside, talking to someone. I couldn't make out who it was, but there was something familiar about the way they stood. Too still, too deliberate. Then they turned, and I saw their face. It was Elijah Mortimer, or at least, it looked like him. The man standing in front of Mrs. Abernathy had the same sharp features, the same piercing eyes. I blinked, and when I looked again, he was gone. There was no sign of anyone across the street, and Mrs. Abernathy was back inside her house, as if nothing had happened. I shook my head, trying to push the image from my mind. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress was getting to me. But as the days passed, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Not by anyone in the street, but by something inside the house. That night, I decided to investigate the basement. I hadn't dared to go down there yet, but the strange noises from below had grown louder. The scratching and scuttling had turned into a low, rasping sound, like something trying to claw its way through the floor. The basement door was thick and weathered, with an old padlock that rattled as I turned the handle. It creaked open, and a blast of cold air hit me. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The basement was vast, stretching far beyond what I could see. Old boxes and broken furniture were piled high, but it was a far corner that drew my attention. There, in the dim light, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A door. It was small, barely noticeable, tucked away behind a pile of old crates. The wood was darker than the rest of the room, the grain of it almost gleaming under the light. I took a step closer. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the door itself was absorbing the heat from the room. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and grasped the handle. It was cold to the touch, but it didn't resist. The door creaked open, revealing a small, windowless room. The air inside was damp, and the smell of mold hit me in the face. But it was the symbols on the walls that made my blood run cold. They were drawn in what looked like charcoal, covering every inch of the walls. Some were familiar, simple crosses or triangles, but others were more complex, intricate designs that I couldn't begin to understand. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Something was wrong with this place. The house wasn't just old, it was hiding something that had been buried for years, waiting to be uncovered. Suddenly I heard it, the footsteps. They were back. This time, they were louder, closer. A heavy thud, then a scrape, like something dragging itself across the floor. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing there. Just the door, the walls, and the symbols. The footsteps didn't stop. They were coming from behind me now, slowly, steadily. I turned to face the noise, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door at the back of the room had swung open, revealing a narrow hallway that led deeper into the house. I hadn't noticed it before. I didn't want to go down there, but something compelled me. Something was calling me. I took a deep breath, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline, I moved toward the hallway. But as my foot crossed the threshold, I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. It spoke my name over and over again until it was a scream that rattled my bones. Come. I froze, my body rooted to the spot. The voice was coming from the end of the hallway, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It was Elijah Mortimer's voice. I ran. I slammed the door shut behind me, and I didn't stop running until I was back in the living room, panting, my heart racing. But when I looked around, I realized Beans was nowhere to be found. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my hands were slick with sweat. The house felt different now. Heavier, somehow. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows longer and darker than before. I rushed through the house, calling for Beans. Beans, where are you? My voice echoed through the empty rooms, but there was no response. The house felt empty, too quiet. The attic door was still open, its frame like a dark mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I glanced up at it but didn't dare approach. Instead, I ran to the hallways, my eyes darting to every corner. I searched the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom, but he was nowhere. I reached the back door and flung it open, hoping to see Beans in the yard, maybe chasing a stray cat or lying in the sun. But the yard was still, the trees swaying lightly in the breeze. Nothing. I stumbled back inside, panic bubbling up in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mrs. Abernathy's number. Maybe she'd seen something. Maybe Beans had run over there. The phone rang 3 times before her voice cracked through the line. Hello, Mrs. Abernathy, it's me. Have you seen my cat? He's gone missing, and There was a long pause on the other end. You're looking for the cat? She asked, her voice sharp, a strange edge to it. Yes, have you seen him? Please, I'm really worried. She let out a heavy sigh. You'd better come over here. There's something you need to see. I didn't question it. My legs were already carrying me out the door before I even realized it. I crossed the street quickly, knocking on her door without a second thought. She opened it with that same unsettling look she'd given me when we first met. Come in, she said, her voice low. I stepped into her living room, the scent of stale tea and tobacco thick in the air. Mrs. Abernathy pointed toward the back of the house, where a door led down to a basement. It wasn't the same basement as mine, but the house was older than I realized. The whole place seemed to twist around itself. "Down there," she said, her face pale. "I found him." I hesitated, a chill creeping up my spine. "What do you mean? Found who?" She didn't answer, just turned and walked toward the basement door. I followed her down the creaky steps into the dim, musty space below. The air was damp and the floorboards groaned under our weight. And there, in the far corner of the basement, was Beans. He was lying still, his body rigid, his eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't just his lifeless form that chilled me. It was the symbols on the floor around him. The same strange symbols from the Mortimer basement. What's going on?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Mrs. Abernathy didn't respond. Instead, she stepped forward and knelt beside Beans, her fingers brushing lightly against his fur. "There's something you need to know about this house," she said softly, "and about the Mortimers. They weren't just interested in the occult. They were obsessed with it. Elijah Mortimer, especially. He wasn't just trying to summon things from beyond. He was trying to bring something in, something ancient." I felt my legs give out, and I sank to the floor, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. "The rituals they performed here weren't just harmless nonsense," she continued. "Elijah knew what he was doing. He didn't just open doors. He made a deal with something that lives inside these walls." She paused, her voice growing darker. "And it's been waiting for the next person to come along. Waiting for you." I shook my head, unable to comprehend what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" I just moved in. I don't." "The house chooses, dear," she said, her voice strangely gentle now. "It chose you. And once it's made its choice, it doesn't let go. You've already felt it, haven't you? The footsteps, the cold, the whispering." I nodded slowly. "But why? Why Beans?" "He didn't do anything." Mrs. Abernathy's gaze softened, though there was something sad in her eyes. "Because you were supposed to find the truth. You were supposed to see it, to understand it. But there's a cost to all of this. You can't leave. Not without consequences." I stood up, my knees weak. "What are you talking about? What do I have to do? Please, tell me how to fix this. I'll do anything. Just give me Beans back." She stepped back, her hands shaking slightly as she ran them through her gray hair. "You can't fix this. The house is already a part of you now, and it doesn't let go without taking something in return." She turned and started back up the stairs, not even glancing back at me. "There's no way out, dear. No way out unless you're ready to join it." I stared at Beans, lying motionless on the floor. The house felt alive, the walls closing in. The whispering was louder now, so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. There was no escape. I could still hear the whispers. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. No. The sound was real, filling the room around me like a living thing. It was a low, guttural hum, as if the house itself was breathing, exhaling through the very walls. The symbols on the floor flickered in my mind's eye, their meaning twisting and changing with every breath I took. Beans was still motionless in the corner. His eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, were locked on something I couldn't see. His stillness terrified me more than anything else in the house. I could feel the house pulling at me, its weight pressing down on my chest. "Please," I whispered. "Please help me." There was no answer. Mrs. Abernathy had gone, and I was left alone in the basement with the suffocating silence and the eerie presence of whatever had claimed this house. I stumbled up the stairs, my mind spinning with the knowledge of what was happening. I thought I could handle it, that I could dismiss the strange noises and the unsettling feelings as paranoia. But the truth was far worse. The house was cursed, and it wasn't just some old superstition. It was alive. It had always been alive. I thought back to Elijah Mortimer's journal, to the rituals he had described. He had known what he was doing. And when I found the attic, I had opened the door, let the darkness inside. I had broken whatever fragile seal had kept it contained. The house chose me. I collapsed into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to shift, bend, and twist in the corners of my vision, as if the house itself were trying to make sense of me. It was a monstrous thing, its foundation steeped in ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge. I could feel it now, its presence, thick and heavy in the air, crawling up my spine, into my head. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. But then I heard something. No. Someone. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it rang clear in my ears. It was faint at first, but growing stronger and unmistakably familiar. Come to me. I turned around, the voice almost tangible, pulling at the edges of my mind. It was calling me, beckoning me toward the staircase leading back up to the attic. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of the house, to leave behind the thing that had been calling to me since the moment I stepped inside. But something else stirred inside me, a strange sense of knowing, a realization. I wasn't just trapped by the house. I had always been trapped by it. Elijah Mortimer had made a deal with something old, something powerful, and now I was part of that deal. I had joined at the moment I set foot in this house. I wasn't just a tenant anymore. I was part of the house's hunger, part of its pact. I walked toward the stairs. Each step was heavier than the last, the air thicker with every breath. The whispers grew louder, forming words I could almost understand now, speaking in languages older than time. The cold that had always hung around the house was now biting, seeping into my skin, pulling me into its chill. The attic door was wide open when I reached the top of the stairs. It wasn't like before. This time, the house welcomed me. The darkness inside seemed to shift, swirling like smoke, drawing me in. I could feel its pull in every part of me. I stepped through the doorway. The room inside was unchanged, the furniture, the old crates, the journal I had found. But now it felt alive. The walls hummed with energy, the symbols drawn across them pulsating, glowing faintly in the dark. And at the center of the room, there was something new, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But then it moved. It was tall, taller than any man should be, and its face was obscured by a hood. It had the shape of a man, but there was something wrong with it, something wrong in the way it stood. The air around it seemed to distort, like a heat wave on a summer day. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel it reaching out to me, its presence stretching across the room. And with it came the whispers, louder, more insistent. Join us. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a part of the house, a manifestation of its curse. It had been waiting for someone to break the seal, to open the door. And now, I was here. But it wasn't just the house calling me anymore. I felt something inside me shift, a desire, a hunger, just like the one that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. I took a step forward. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its approval, the coldness of its power washing over me. It was as if the house itself was waiting for me to make the final choice, to become a part of it. I reached out a trembling hand. Before I could touch it, the house groaned. The sound filled the room, loud and harsh. The figure disappeared, swallowed by the darkness, and the house began to shake. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it claim me fully. But as I raced through the house, I felt something snap inside me. I reached the front door, my fingers fumbling for the handle, but it was stuck, locked tight. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, suffocating me. I screamed, and then nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, pressing my palm against the door, the whispers like 1,000 voices speaking over each other in my ears. I could feel my mind starting to unravel, the edges of reality blurring as the house closed in around me. It was no longer just a place to live. It was a living entity, its very walls steeped in dread, its pulse beating in time with my own. I thought I could run. I thought I could leave, escape from whatever had taken root here. But as I tugged harder on the door handle, The coldness pressed into me. The door wouldn't open. The house wouldn't let me go. It was as if the very air had thickened, become a weight too heavy to bear. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I realized that, somehow, I wasn't standing alone in that room anymore. There was something behind me, watching me, waiting. I spun around. There was nothing there, nothing I could see, but the air had shifted. It was colder now, biting against my skin. The shadows in the corners seemed to have stretched longer, reaching toward me like dark, insistent fingers. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away from the unseen presence. My head was spinning, a dizzying mix of panic and confusion. I didn't know what was real anymore, didn't know what was waiting for me in the dark corners of this cursed house. And then I heard it again, the soft whisper of my name coming from the direction of the stairs. Come. I froze. It was low, almost sweet, like a lover's call. But it wasn't a lover calling me. It was the house, the thing that lived inside it. I knew now that there was no way out. The house had claimed me, whether I wanted it or not. And it was hungry. It wanted me to understand. The floor shifted beneath my feet, and I was falling, plunging downward into the depths of the house. The sensation was like being dragged down by unseen hands, sinking into a cold, dark abyss. The walls closed in around me, the air thick and oppressive. When I finally hit the ground, I couldn't tell where I was. My body ached from the fall, but I managed to push myself to my feet. I wiped the dust from my eyes and looked around. The space was dark, but there was something about it. The smell of earth and old, stale air that made my skin crawl. I was in the basement again, but this time it was different. The room had changed. The walls, once plain and cracked with age, were now covered in the same symbols I had seen before, drawn with what looked like ash but freshly made. The floor was lined with candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows along the walls. And in the center of it all, there was a circle. The symbol inside the circle wasn't like the others. It was a design that twisted and turned in on itself, like an eye watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that it wasn't just a symbol. It was a doorway. I didn't want to approach it, but something inside me, something dark and ancient, compelled me forward toward the very heart of the house's power. I could feel it, the pull of the circle, the draw of whatever it was that had claimed this place. And then I saw it. At the center of the circle, an object lay. It was small, just a few inches in diameter, but it gleamed in the candlelight. A black stone, smooth and polished, with strange markings carved into its surface. It looked almost alive. I couldn't help it. My hand reached out. The moment my fingers brushed against the stone, a jolt of electricity shot through my body. It was as if the house itself had surged through me, pouring its darkness into my soul. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, becoming a cacophony of voices. They spoke in tongues, the words unrecognizable, their meaning clear only in the way they twisted and writhed in my mind. I pulled my hand away, but it was too late. The stone pulsed in my palm, its energy now connected to me, binding me to the house. The floor trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with a presence, something powerful, something ancient. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air I breathed. And then I saw him, Elijah Mortimer. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide with a manic gleam. He was no longer just a memory, a shadow of the past. He was here in the house, his form flickering like a ghost, but real enough to make my skin crawl. "You've come to join us," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. Just as I did, just as you always would. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The house had me in its grip, and there was no escaping it. His laughter filled the room, a sound that made my blood run cold. "There is no way out," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "The house has claimed you now. You belong to it. You belong to us. And then, as if on cue, the walls of the house began to close in. The whispers wouldn't stop. They were constant, like an unrelenting hum in my ears, vibrating through my skull and into my bones. I couldn't escape them, couldn't shut them out. They had invaded me, become part of me. There was no line anymore, no separation between what I had been and what I was becoming. The darkness that surrounded me was thick, smothering. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. It wasn't the house that held me. No, it was something deeper, more insidious. It was inside me now, inside my mind, twisting and contorting, filling every inch of my being with its cold, ancient malice. I looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was back in the house, but it wasn't like before. The walls were damp, their surfaces slick and alive, writhing in the dim light. The floor seemed to pulse under my feet, as if the house itself were breathing, shifting with the weight of its terrible secret. You belong to us? The words echoed in my mind again, and I almost wished I could rip them out, silence them, but they clung to me like a disease. The voice of the woman, the shadow I had seen in the darkness, lingered, her cruel smile etched into my thoughts. I stumbled forward, moving through the house with a sense of direction that wasn't mine. It was as if the house was guiding me, pulling me toward something. My eyes were wide, but everything felt distant, like I was seeing through a fog, like I wasn't fully there. My body moved on its own, each step leading me further into the heart of the house, into the place I'd already crossed into, the place that had already taken hold of me. I found myself standing in front of the staircase, the one that led to the attic, the place where it had all begun. But now, it was different. The stairs groaned under my weight, the wood bending and creaking as if the house itself were preparing for something. The air grew colder the higher I went, and by the time I reached the attic, the chill had become unbearable, biting at my skin. The attic door was wide open, just like it had been before, but this time it felt welcoming, as if the house was urging me inside. I stepped through without hesitation, feeling the weight of the darkness pressed down on me. The room was exactly as I had left it, the same old crates, the same furniture, the same journal. But now, there was something else. The symbol on the floor was glowing, faintly at first, but steadily growing brighter, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. The air hummed with energy, and I could feel the pulse of the house reverberating through me, pulling me closer to the center of it all. I could see it now. The door, the same one I had seen in the basement, the one that had opened. It was standing there, not just a symbol, but a gateway. It was pulsating, beating with a dark, hungry rhythm, and I could feel it calling to me. I reached for the journal, flipping through the pages, but my hands felt slow, unsteady. I wasn't in control anymore. The house was in control. The words on the pages blurred as I read them, the ink shifting and changing, morphing into something else. The rituals, the sacrifices, the pact. You are the final piece, the woman's voice whispered in my ear, and I could almost feel her breath on my skin. We are waiting for you. We have always been waiting for you. The ground beneath my feet shifted. The air became thick with the taste of blood and rot. I could feel the house closing in around me, its very foundation shaking with anticipation. The walls trembled, as if they were alive, breathing, waiting for the moment when the final door would open. I stepped toward it. I couldn't stop myself. My body was no longer mine, no longer just flesh and bone. It had become part of something else, something much older, much darker. The house wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, and I was becoming one with it. I placed my hand on the door. The coldness was like nothing I had ever felt before, as if the door itself was made of ice, but deeper, older. It burned with a cold that seemed to reach into my soul. And when I touched it, I felt the shift, the tear in the fabric of reality. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the air around me began to crackle with energy. I pulled my hand away. I tried to step back, but the door was open. It had opened, whether I wanted it to or not. And from the depths of the darkness beyond the door, something stepped through. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. It was nothing and everything all at once, shifting and moving, its shape constantly changing, its form rippling like smoke. And it was hungry. I could feel it reaching for me, pulling me in with an unbearable force. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My body refused to move, rooted to the spot, frozen in place. "You are ours," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison. "You were always ours." And then I felt it. It wasn't just a sensation. It was a truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a haunt. It had always been a haunt. The darkness that had taken root here was older than the house itself, older than the city, older than time. And it was feeding on me, but it wasn't finished. No! It was only just beginning. The door slammed shut behind me. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the air went still, too still. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath, holding it in, waiting for something. I could feel the cold. It was no longer just a chill. It was an invasion, creeping beneath my skin, chilling my very soul. The thing behind the door, the thing that had stepped through, wasn't just watching me. It was inside me, its presence crawling through my veins like poison, sinking into my mind, twisting my thoughts. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, locked in place, every muscle screaming to act, to run, to escape. But the moment I tried to move, the darkness seemed to tighten around me, like chains wrapping themselves around my limbs. I could barely breathe, as if the very air had thickened and become too heavy to take in. I glanced around, but there was nowhere to go. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. They all felt wrong, alive, pulsing with the same dark energy that had filled the house since the moment I stepped inside. The house wasn't a building anymore. It was an organism, a creature with a mind of its own, and I was its prey. The whispers started again, growing louder, more frantic, pressing against my skull. 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "You're not alone." I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't human. It was the voice of the house, the voice of the thing behind the door. "You can't run." The walls seemed to shift, to move, as if they were breathing. The floorboards creaked, and I could feel the pulse of the house deep in my chest. It was alive, and it was hungry. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the smooth, damp floor. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense here. The house had stopped making sense a long time ago. It wasn't a place to live. It was a place to consume. "It's too late to escape," the voice whispered again, and this time I felt it inside me, in the deepest parts of my mind. "You belong to it now. You are part of it. We will never let you go." I shook my head, trying to deny it, but I knew it was true. The house had taken me, just as it had taken everyone before me. I wasn't just a tenant here anymore. I was its. Something moved in the shadows, and I turned to face it. There, in the corner of the attic, a shape emerged from the darkness. It was familiar and yet unfamiliar. It was a figure, a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide and hollow, sunken into his skull, his lips cracked into a grotesque grin. It was Elijah Mortimer. "You didn't listen," he said, his voice raspy and cold. "You thought you could leave. You thought you could run. But you can't. None of us can. Not once it has you." I tried to back away, my body moving on instinct, but the floor beneath me seemed to sink with every step I took. It wasn't just the weight of the house. It was the weight of all of it. The curses, the rituals, the things that had been awakened. I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't understand, something that had been buried here for so long. You have to understand, Elijah's voice was softer now, more sympathetic, as if he pitied me. The house doesn't just take you in, it breaks you. It makes you part of it. And when it's done, you will never leave. Not in the way you think. I reach for the door again, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. I tried to pull it open, but it was no use. The door was solid, immovable, like it was part of the very foundation of the house itself. "Don't bother," Elijah said with a hollow laugh. "It's already too late." A cold wind whipped through the attic, a gust that seemed to carry with it the scent of earth, rot, and something far worse, something I couldn't name. My skin crawled as I felt the presence of something behind me, something vast and ancient, just waiting, watching. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, only darkness. And then I saw it, a shadow. No, not just a shadow, a shape darker than the surrounding blackness, moving toward me with a slow, deliberate pace. I could feel it pulling me in, could feel its hunger reaching out, surrounding me. The house itself seemed to draw closer, the walls pressing in, suffocating me with their oppressive weight. The thing that had haunted this house for so long was awake now, and it was coming for me. I felt a rush of panic surge through me, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. I wanted to run, to escape, but the house had already closed around me. The thing in the corner, the shadow, stepped into the light, revealing itself. It was massive, impossibly so, its form writhing and shifting like a nightmare-made flesh. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. Its body was twisted, covered in scales and patches of decayed flesh, its eyes gleaming with an inhuman intelligence. And then I understood. It wasn't just a thing. It was the house, the heart of it, the thing that had been lurking beneath its floorboards, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone like me to awaken it. And it was hungry. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, filling my ears, my mind. "You're already part of us. Forever." The darkness closed in and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The weight of the house crushed me, its hunger consuming me, pulling me into its depths. And then darkness. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't make sense anymore. The house has eaten it, swallowed it whole, like it swallowed everything else. The clock on the wall doesn't tick. The light from the attic window doesn't change. I haven't seen the sun in what feels like weeks, or months, or maybe even years. It's just this, the house. I can hear it now. The thing that lives in the walls, the thing that has always lived here, always waited here, always hungered here. It breathes, it moves, it shifts, and I am nothing more than a guest in its prison. I can feel it. I feel it all the time now. Its presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every whisper that brushes against my ear in the dead of night. It's watching me, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to fall deeper, deeper into its grasp. The air in this room is thick, too thick, suffocating me with every breath I take. It presses against my chest like hands cold and tight. I can't get away from it. The house is all around me now. It has become me, and I have become it. I can feel it in my skin, in my mind, in my soul. The thing I saw in the attic, that thing that had stepped through the door, the one that was part of the house, part of the curse, it has changed me. I know that now. It's inside me, not just inside the house, but inside my head. It whispers, it murmurs, it tells me things, horrible things, things I can't unhear. "You belong to it now," it says. "You are ours. You cannot escape." I thought I could fight it. I thought I could leave, that I could break free from whatever dark force was binding me to this place. But the house doesn't let you leave, not if it doesn't want you to. It doesn't matter where I go. The door won't open. The windows won't budge. The walls are too thick too solid, like they were made to keep me inside. I tried once to break a window, to shatter the glass and crawl out, but it didn't work. The house moved. I remember the first time I heard it. The floorboards creaked behind me, just as I was about to make my escape. But when I turned around, I saw it. A shadow, but it was no shadow. It was the house itself, shifting, pulsating, bending the world around it. It was everywhere at once, stretching across the room, pressing in from all sides, and I couldn't breathe. The air grew colder, and I saw the door to the attic open by itself. The shadow reached toward me, its fingers cold and long, like the limbs of a thing that shouldn't exist. "You can't escape," it whispered. "You are already ours." The shadows tightened around me, and I couldn't move. The walls closed in. The floor gave way beneath me. I fell, and I didn't know where I was, but I knew where I wasn't. I wasn't outside anymore. I wasn't free. The house had won. The door to the attic creaked open again, and I saw it. The thing that had stepped through, the thing that had taken form from the very essence of the house. Its eyes, dark as coal, shone with malice, its body shifting and warping like liquid smoke. It was watching me, studying me. "You've broken," it said, its voice low and hissing, like the sound of something ancient and alive. "You belong to us now. There is no going back." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The pressure on my chest, the weight of the house, it suffocated me. I felt like I was being crushed, pressed into the walls, becoming one with the very structure of the house. I couldn't think. I couldn't feel. All that existed was the house, the darkness, the cold. The house had taken everything from me, my life, my mind, my will, and now it was taking my soul. I fell to my knees, the weight of it too much to bear. I could feel the house's hunger, its insatiable need to consume me, to consume everything. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wanted everything, everyone. It was endless, and I was nothing more than a tool to feed it. I can hear it now, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, heavy, slow, deliberate. The footsteps of the thing that had taken hold of this place, the one who had opened the door and never closed it, the one who had set this cycle in motion, the thing that was me now. I looked down at my hands, and I saw the darkness creeping up my arms, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the house. It was in my skin, in my veins, in my soul. I was no longer me. The footsteps stopped behind me, and I didn't dare turn around. I already knew what would be there. "You will never leave," the voice whispered, its echo filling the space. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I was the next one to break, the next one to become part of the house, part of the darkness, forever. There is no escape. I've come to understand that now. I can feel it deep in my bones, in every breath I take. The house has consumed me, and it will consume everything else. All those who come after me, all those who believe they can make it out, will find the same thing waiting for them. There is no end. There is no freedom. There is only the house and the hunger and the darkness. I've become a part of it, woven into the fabric of this place. The walls, the floors, the attic, the very air itself. Everything is me now, just as I am part of it. I can hear the whispers in the corners of my mind, feel the house stretching out into the night, waiting for the next person to fall into its trap. But I will never know who they are. I will never see them, because I am not me anymore. I am lost, and I'm no longer sure if I ever truly existed in the first place. I think I'm the last one, the last of the tenants, the last to be consumed by this house. I think I'm the final chapter, the one they were always waiting for. But I can't be sure anymore. Time no longer matters. The house has already begun to settle, to shift again. The floors creak beneath me as if it's breathing in deep, stretching its walls in anticipation. It's ready for the next one, and in some strange, sickening way, I'm part of that too. I'm a thread in the tapestry, one that was always destined to be woven in, never to be unraveled. I stand at the window, staring out into the night. The moon is full, casting a dim light across the street. Across the world I will never belong to again. It feels so distant, so far removed from where I am. I can almost feel the world moving on without me, as if it has forgotten I ever existed. But I know better. I know what waits for the next person, the next tenant who stumbles into this house, this prison. I can hear them sometimes. The others. They're here with me, even now. Their voices, their whispers, their footsteps in the hallways. Sometimes they reach out to me, calling my name, begging for help. But I cannot help them. I am just like them now. One more soul lost in the dark. One more voice that will never be heard. And yet, I still hear it. The call, the pull, the hunger. I can feel it in my chest. It grows stronger, deeper, until it feels like my very heart is a part of the house. Like I am the house now, pulsing with its energy, its darkness. I wish I could say I'm not afraid, but the truth is, I am terrified. I'm terrified of what I've become, of what I'll continue to be. I'm terrified that I'll never leave, that I'll never find peace again. But I know there's no hope. There's nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the next person. Wait for the next soul to fall into the trap, to come here, to live here, to become part of it all. Because the house will never stop. It will never let go. And I am part of that. I always was. Story 3. The first time I saw the house, I told myself it had character. That's what people say when they want to ignore the flaws in something, right? Character was my way of brushing off the sagging porch steps, the chipped paint, and the cracked windows. But after the divorce, I needed somewhere affordable, somewhere quiet, a place where I could start over. I found it on a whim, scrolling through rental listings late one night. The pictures weren't impressive, dark and blurry, like the landlord was trying to hide something. Still, the rent was cheap, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and an attic. It sounded perfect. When I first pulled up to the house, the air felt heavier, like the neighborhood carried a secret it didn't want to share. I convinced myself it was just nerves. Moving to a new town, starting a new job, it was a lot. The house was old, sure, but I'd always liked older places. They had stories, history. The landlord, Mr. Halverson, was waiting for me on the porch. He was a wiry man with glasses that were too large for his face, his nervous smile framed by a thick mustache. He handed me the keys and gave me a quick rundown of the place. "All bones," he said, patting one of the door frames as we walked inside. "She creaks and groans, but she's sturdy. Plumbing works fine. Heat's a bit temperamental, but you won't freeze. Just holler if you need anything." The tour was brief, and he left me standing in the empty living room before I could ask many questions. As I looked around, I told myself it wasn't so bad. The hardwood floors were scratched, the wallpaper peeled in spots, and there was a faint smell of mildew, but nothing I couldn't handle. The first few hours were spent unpacking. I didn't have much. A couple of suitcases, some furniture, and a stack of boxes filled with books, dishes, and memories of a life I was trying to leave behind. By the time I was done, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house had taken on a different feel. It was quiet, too quiet. My neighbor, Mrs. Carpenter, was the first person I met. She appeared on the sidewalk as I hauled the last box from my car. Her wiry frame hunched slightly as she shuffled toward me. "You're brave, moving in there," she said, her voice raspy but tinged with something that felt like pity. "Why's that?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. "Oh, nothing," she replied too quickly, waving her hand. "Just rumors, you know how people talk. The house has been empty for a while. No one ever stays long. Why not?" She hesitated, glancing at the house as if it might overhear her. "Strange things mostly. Noises. Lights flickering. Couple years back, some guy came running out in the middle of the night. swearing he saw something in the attic. I laughed nervously, brushing her words off as small-town gossip. Well, I don't scare easy. She didn't laugh. Instead, she offered me a tight-lipped smile and shuffled back to her house, her eyes lingering on mine a moment too long. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed her words in my head. Strange things, noises. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I pulled the blankets tighter around me. Just the house settling, I told myself. But when I heard the faint creak of footsteps in the hallway, I wasn't so sure. The sound came again, soft, deliberate steps, like someone walking on the floorboards outside my room. My heart raced. I stared at the ceiling, listening intently, willing the noise to stop. It wasn't the wind this time. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. I sat up, the sheets rustling beneath me. I thought about calling the landlord, but that seemed ridiculous. He'd probably tell me it was just the house settling, the old wood stretching and groaning in the night. People say that about old houses all the time, don't they? It's just a house, nothing to worry about. I told myself it was nothing. I forced myself to breathe, closing my eyes and trying to drift back to sleep. But the footsteps didn't stop. They echoed down the hallway, slow and methodical. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around. I felt the cold prickling of sweat on my neck, my mind racing through possibilities. Could it be Mrs. Carpenter, just being friendly and stopping by to check in? No! That didn't make sense. The steps were heavier, more deliberate. I threw back the covers and swung my legs off the bed. The floor creaked under my feet as I stood up, every movement making me acutely aware of the silence pressing in around me. The only sound was the steady rhythm of those footsteps outside my door. I crept toward the hallway, straining my ears. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the curtains. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I paused, my breath shallow, listening for any other sound. Nothing. I opened the door slowly, wincing as it creaked on its hinges. The hallway stretched out before me, shrouded in shadows. No one was there, but the footsteps continued, now coming from the stairwell that led up to the attic. Heavy, echoing, like someone or something was pacing up there. I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. My feet felt rooted to the floor, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to see. I reached the stairs, my hand hovering near the banister. The air around me was unnaturally cold. My breath came out in wisps of mist, even though the heat had been on when I went to bed. The cold seemed to seep into my bones as I started to climb. Each step I took creaked louder than the last. The house seemed to groan in protest, like it was warning me. But I was already halfway up when I heard it. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy scraping across the floor above me. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt an icy grip of fear clutching my throat. I almost turned back, but then, just as suddenly as the noise had started, it stopped. The silence felt suffocating, and I realized my feet had carried me to the top of the stairs without my conscious consent. The attic door was ajar. A thin sliver of darkness lay beyond it. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but it wasn't this. The room was empty, nothing out of place, no signs of disturbance. The only thing that caught my eye was a small wooden chest in the far corner, its lid slightly askew. I felt foolish for having come all this way. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, they were closer, moving toward me. I spun around. My breath hitched in my throat, but there was no one there. Only the chill of the attic air that seemed to cling to my skin. I hurried back down the stairs, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind me. The footsteps, the scraping noises, they all seemed to echo in my ears, following me like a shadow. I stumbled back to my room, locking the door behind me and burying myself under the blankets. But as I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my racing heart, I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone in this house. The next morning, I woke up with a start, my heart still racing from the night before. I had barely slept, the image of the attic door creeping into my mind every time I closed my eyes. The cold from the night still lingered in the air, and the house felt heavier somehow, as if the walls were closing in around me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The house was old. Old houses creaked and groaned. That's all it was. I spent the day unpacking the last of my boxes and setting up the living room, trying to make the place feel like home. I kept the attic door closed. I tried not to think about the footsteps, but every time I passed that door, I could feel an unease building inside me. Around midday, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The house felt suffocating, and the fresh air might help me put things into perspective. Mrs. Carpenter wasn't outside when I left, but as I passed her house, I saw her peering out from behind her curtains. She watched me intently, her eyes narrowing as I walked by. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the way she looked at me unsettled me. When I returned an hour later, I found a note taped to my door. It was written in thick, looping handwriting. "Don't go up there." My first instinct was to tear it up, laugh it off as some odd joke, but my fingers froze on the paper. The handwriting was too careful, too deliberate. It sent a shiver down my spine. My eyes flicked toward the attic door, and I felt that familiar, creeping dread. I glanced around the yard, hoping to catch sight of Mrs. Carpenter. She was standing at her window again, watching me. I stared back for a long moment, but she didn't move. She just stood there, her eyes unwavering. I went inside and locked the door behind me. The note was still clutched in my hand as I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at it. "Don't go up there." The words seemed to echo in my mind, repeating themselves like a chant. I knew I had to know what was in the attic. Whatever was going on in this house, whatever had been making those sounds, I needed to understand it. The fear gnawed at me, but there was something else too, an urge, a pull that I couldn't explain. That night, after a restless dinner of frozen pizza, I found myself standing at the foot of the attic stairs again. My heart hammered in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat. But I couldn't turn back now. I reached for the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and pushed it open. The air hit me like a wall of cold, and the faint smell of something old and damp washed over me. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, each step groaning in protest. When I reached the top, the attic was just as I remembered, empty, save for the chest in the corner. But something was different this time. A low whispering, soft but insistent, filled the room. It was barely audible, a faint murmur that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I froze, my pulse leaping in my throat. The voice was unintelligible at first, but as I listened more closely, I could make out the words, whispers of a language I didn't understand. The tone was guttural, angry like a chant. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Only the chest, still slightly open, and the oppressive dark that seemed to press in around me. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, and I could feel a strange pull toward the chest. My hands trembled as I walked toward it, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet. With a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but an old, weathered journal. It was small, the leather cover cracked and worn. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for it. The whispers stopped the moment my fingers touched the journal, leaving the attic unnervingly silent. I opened it slowly, the yellowed pages crinkling in protest. The handwriting was the same as the note on my door, thick, looping letters that seemed to spill out of the page. I scanned the first few lines. Asterisk, the house is a doorway. It calls to you beckoning. They will come for you as they came for him. There is no escape. The door will open and you will be taken. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The cold in the room had intensified, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I backed away from the chest, my eyes darting around the attic. That's when I heard it again, footsteps. Not in the hall this time, but right behind me. Heavy, deliberate, pacing the floor as if someone was standing just out of sight. I turned around, but there was no one there. No one except the journal, and the darkness closing in on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I fled down the stairs, the sound of those footsteps following me, echoing louder with each step. I slammed the attic door shut behind me and locked it, my breath ragged and uneven. But as I stood in the living room, still clutching the journal, I realized something. I hadn't been alone. Not for a long time. The following days blurred together in a haze of anxiety. The house felt different, heavier, darker, as if it had grown aware of my presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows felt like a whisper from something older than the house itself. The journal sat on my coffee table, its presence like a weight I couldn't escape. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend like everything was normal, but the fear gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I spent my mornings at work and my evenings pacing around the house, too afraid to stay still for long. The footsteps continued, always at night, growing closer, more insistent. Sometimes they sounded like boots dragging on the floor. Other times, they sounded like soft, shuffling steps, as if someone or something was sneaking around in the dark. But the worst part wasn't the footsteps. It was the silence that followed. I found myself drawn back to the attic, to the journal. There was something in it, something I couldn't ignore. It felt like a calling, one I was terrified to answer but couldn't help but follow. The words in the journal weren't just ramblings. They were warnings. The man who had written them, someone named Henry Caldwell, had lived in this house long before I ever arrived. According to the pages, he had been a scholar, obsessed with the occult and dark rituals. He believed this house was a portal, a doorway to something ancient, something dark and hungry. Each entry in the journal described rituals, symbols, and strange occurrences. Henry's handwriting grew more erratic as the days went on. The last few pages were barely legible, the words scrawled in a frantic hand. Asterisk, I've seen them. They stand in the corners of the rooms, watching. Their eyes glow in the dark. The ritual failed. They are here. They will never leave. Asterisk. I couldn't stop reading, even though I knew I shouldn't. My mind raced as I tried to piece together the fragments of his story. But one thing became clear. Henry had tried to summon something he hadn't fully understood. And whatever it was, it had stayed. It had never left. I had to know more. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to pack up and walk away from this cursed house. But something kept pulling me back. I couldn't explain it, but I needed answers. I started digging into the history of the house. I went to the town library and combed through old records. At first, everything seemed normal. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Gregory Blythe. There were no indications of anything unusual in the early years. But when I dug deeper, I found mentions of Henry Caldwell, the man from the journal. He hadn't just been a tenant. He had lived in the house for years, conducting his rituals in secret. A newspaper article from 1915 caught my eye. The headline read, Asterisk local man found dead in mysterious circumstances. House known for unexplained phenomena. Asterisk, it mentioned Henry Caldwell's death, which had been ruled a suicide. The article was vague, but it hinted that he had been found in the attic, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in chalk. I felt the familiar coldness seep into my bones as I read on. The article mentioned that Caldwell's family had left town shortly after his death, and the house had remained empty for years. But the last line struck me the most. Asterisk, rumors persist that the house is cursed, and that those who live there will never truly leave. Asterisk, I was no longer just dealing with a haunted house. This place was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend, tied to something older, darker. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to go back to the attic. If I didn't confront whatever was here, whatever Henry had unleashed, I would never be free. That night, the house felt different, more oppressive. The air was thick with a tension I couldn't explain. As I stood at the bottom of the stairs, I could hear the faint whispers again, echoing from the attic. The sound was familiar now, almost comforting in its predictability, but no less terrifying. I took the journal with me this time. I knew I couldn't face whatever awaited me without it. The attic door creaked open, just as it had the night before, and I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, and the familiar musty smell of the attic filled my nose. The chest was still in the corner, and the journal's words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, the door will open and you will be taken. Asterisk, I walked toward it slowly, my feet heavy as though the air itself was trying to pull me back. I set the journal down on the floor and hesitated for a moment before I opened the chest again. This time, it felt different, like something was waiting for me. Inside the chest, beneath the journal, was a pile of old, brittle papers. As I lifted them, I felt something shift in the air. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. And then, just as I was about to read the first paper, I heard it, a soft, echoing laugh. It was low, hollow, like something that hadn't been heard in decades. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp in the corners of the room, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, standing just out of the reach of the dim light, was a figure that wasn't there before. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the figure in the corner of the attic. It was tall, but indistinct, like the shadows had taken form. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The coldness in the room intensified, and I shivered despite myself. My first instinct was to run, to flee from the attic and never look back. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my mind too filled with terror to think clearly. The whispers around me grew louder, more frantic, almost as if they were urging me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was tall, looming in the shadows, but its features were obscured, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it. No eyes, no face, just a shape, a silhouette, standing motionless. The air around it shimmered, and I felt my chest tighten with a cold, suffocating fear. Then, as if it had heard my thoughts, the figure moved. It glided toward me, slow but deliberate, its movements fluid and unnatural. I stumbled backward, my hands scrambling for something to hold on to. The journal. I had to get the journal. I had to understand what it meant. But before I could reach it, the figure spoke. It was a low, rasping whisper, a voice that didn't belong in this world. The words felt like they were crawling beneath my skin, scratching their way into my mind. Asterisk, leave, asterisk. The word was a command, not a plea. I stumbled backward again, my mind screaming for me to run. But the attic felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing inward with each breath I took. The figure came closer, its presence suffocating, its form growing more defined with every passing second. I could feel its cold, like it was seeping into my very soul. Asterisk, leave now, asterisk. The voice was stronger this time, a hint of anger in it, a desperate, twisted anger that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was a blur of panic. The figure stopped just in front of me, and I could feel the air around me crackling with an unnatural energy. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice was lost, trapped somewhere deep inside me. I was standing face to face with it, unable to look away. The darkness around the figure seemed to deepen, swirling in on itself like a living thing. It was everywhere now, consuming the space between us, filling the room with an oppressive weight. And then, in the midst of the silence, I heard it again, the laugh. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the darkness, low and hollow, like the sound of something long dead. I felt it in my bones, vibrating deep within me. I had to get out. I had to get away from it. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I turned and bolted for the stairs. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, but I didn't care. I had to get out of that attic, out of the house. I heard the figure behind me, its footsteps echoing in the silence, closer with each passing second. I reached the top of the stairs and almost tumbled down them in my haste. The air seemed to grow colder, the pressure building with every step. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to look back, the attic door slammed shut on its own, the house groaning in protest. I stood there, gasping for breath, the weight of the house pressing down on me. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But something stopped me. I looked down at the journal in my hands. The pages, which had once seemed so innocuous, were now stained with something dark and sticky. My fingers trembled as I flipped through them. The ink was running, as though the words themselves were bleeding. I turned to the last page, my heart thudding in my chest. The words were no longer written in the careful, looping script I had seen before. They were jagged, erratic, as if the writer had been trembling when they wrote them. Asterisk, I see them now. They are here. They have opened the door, and I cannot close it. I am trapped in their world, and they will take me. You will be next. Asterisk. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I read the last line. The words blurred, swimming in front of my eyes, but I knew what they meant. Whatever had been awakened in this house, whatever Henry Caldwell had tried to summon, was still here. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something more, something alive, and it was waiting for me. I dropped the journal, the thud of it hitting the floor echoing through the empty house. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I had to leave, now. But as I reached for the door, I heard it again, the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder, more urgent. Asterisk, you can't escape, asterisk. I turned around, my blood running cold, but there was no one there. The house was silent, the air thick with a presence that I couldn't see, but could feel. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming toward me from the darkness. It wasn't a house settling this time. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me all along. I didn't dare to turn around. The footsteps behind me grew louder, each step echoing like a drumbeat, relentless and heavy. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat slicking my skin. The air felt dense, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I didn't need to look. My heart was telling me everything I needed to know. Whatever was following me, it wasn't human. The house creaked and groaned, the walls seeming to bend inward, as if the very structure of the building was alive, constricting around me. I could hear the whispers again, faint at first, but they were growing louder, closer, surrounding me. The sound of my own frantic breathing filled the room, but it was drowned out by the slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to come from every corner of the house. I knew that if I turned around, I would see it. I would see whatever had been watching me, whatever had followed me into this house. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to know. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, though it felt unnaturally cold under my touch, as if the house itself were trying to push me away. But I refused to be stopped. I wrenched the door open and stepped into the hallway, my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped immediately, and the house fell silent. But that silence, it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, thick with something that didn't belong. I could feel it, just beyond the edge of my vision, lurking in the shadows. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but the thought of stepping back into the night, into the unknown, felt like an equally terrifying prospect. I had nowhere to go. The journal, lying discarded on the floor behind me, called to me. I didn't know why, but I felt an unexplainable pull toward it. It was as though the house, or whatever was in it, was demanding that I know more, that I understand the curse that had been set into motion long before I ever stepped foot in this place. But I didn't want to. I had already seen too much. The house was alive, and whatever haunted it, whatever had been unleashed by Henry Caldwell's rituals, was coming for me. I took a step backward, my heart thumping louder in my chest. But before I could move further, a soft, familiar sound stopped me in my tracks. The whispering. It was louder now, surrounding me, filling my ears with a language I didn't understand. The words were foreign, ancient, as if they had been spoken by something that predated humanity itself. I could feel them crawling beneath my skin, making my head spin. Asterisk, leave now, or you will be taken, asterisk. The voice was different this time, calm, almost soothing, like a dark lullaby. But the coldness in the words made my blood run cold. The presence that had been following me, that had been growing closer, was now right behind me. I could feel its breath on my neck, like a cold wind, and I knew that if I turned around, I would see it, whatever it was. But I didn't turn. I couldn't. I backed away, my legs shaking, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest exit. I had to get out. I had to escape this nightmare. But just as I stepped toward the door, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a low, guttural growl. My body went cold with fear. The growl was not from any animal I recognized. It was deep, throaty, like something massive, something ancient and terrifying, and it was right behind me. I spun around, heart racing, ready to run, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, just the endless, suffocating darkness. And then I heard it again, a footstep, soft but unmistakable. It was getting closer. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of my feet hitting the floor seemed deafening in the silence, but the footsteps behind me were louder, chasing me. I reached the stairs and ran up them without thinking, not even looking to see if whatever was following me was still there. The attic. I had to go to the attic. Maybe if I could make it up there, I could find something, anything, that could explain what was happening to me. I didn't know what else to do. The fear was overwhelming, but the need to understand, to find out what had been awakened in this house, was even stronger. I reached the attic door, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. The whispering grew louder in my ears, filling my mind with thoughts I couldn't control. Asterisk, leave now. Leave before it's too late, asterisk. But it was already too late. The moment the door creaked open, I knew something was wrong. The air in the attic was thick with an unnatural cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest, and immediately I felt it, an oppressive force pressing down on me, like something was suffocating the room. The chest in the corner stood as it had before, but the atmosphere in the room was different. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned, as though something was moving underneath them. I approached the chest cautiously, the whispers still swirling around me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence waiting, lurking just beyond my reach. I opened the chest slowly, and there, nestled at the bottom, was something new, a small weathered box, its surface covered in strange symbols. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside was a faded, yellowed parchment, covered in the same markings. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing with an eerie energy that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. And then the whisper stopped, dead silence, and in that silence I heard it, a voice, clear as day, right behind me. Asterisk, you should never have come here, asterisk. I spun around, heart thudding wildly in my chest. There, standing at the far corner of the attic, was a figure. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline of something tall, something unnatural. It was as though the shadows themselves had taken form, twisting into the shape of a person, a presence so dark it seemed to suck the very light out of the room. My mouth went dry. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as though my body had frozen in place, unable to react. But the figure wasn't still. It shifted, its form undulating in the dim light, its edges blurring and reforming. It felt like it was getting closer, though I couldn't see it move. It was there one moment, and then closer the next, as though it existed outside the rules of space and time. Asterisk, you shouldn't have opened it. Asterisk, the voice repeated, now much clearer, much more distinct. It was cold, inhuman. I could feel its weight pressing down on me, suffocating me, as though the very air had become thick and dense with dread. The figure's form shifted again, and I thought I saw something. Eyes. Eyes that glowed in the darkness, hollow and empty, yet filled with a profound, terrifying knowledge. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs wouldn't move, and my throat felt tight, like the very air in this house was strangling me. The voice came again, this time with a hint of menace. Asterisk, you have opened the door. Now you must face what comes through it. Asterisk. The attic felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in on me. The figure in the corner wasn't just a shape anymore. It had grown more defined, more solid. I could see a face now, a twisted, distorted version of a human face. Its features were elongated, like a mask of horror that had been stretched and warped beyond recognition. Its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, stared at me with an intensity that felt like they were searing through my very soul. I backed away, my hands shaking violently as I reached for the door. But the moment I turned my back, the footsteps came again, soft at first, then growing louder, closer. I could hear the shuffling of feet, the dragging of something heavy behind me. The figure in the corner didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, following me as I backed toward the stairs. The chest, the box. I knew what it was now. I knew what I had done. That box, the symbols, the parchment inside it. It was more than just a ritual. It was an invitation for whatever was on the other side to come through. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait to find out what would happen next. But I couldn't leave without knowing, without understanding the full horror of what I had unleashed. I grabbed the box from the chest and shoved it into my coat pocket, then turned to flee. My legs were finally working again, but they felt unsteady, like I was walking on a surface that could give way at any moment. The house seemed to be alive with sound. Footsteps that weren't mine, doors creaking open, whispers that filled the air with a noise too terrible to ignore. I reached the top of the stairs, heart racing, and turned to look behind me. The figure was gone, but the shadows in the attic still swirled, still moved, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I didn't wait. I rushed down the stairs, my feet pounding against the creaking wood, and didn't look back again. I made it to the front door, hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. The whispers, no, voices, were louder now, their words unintelligible but unmistakably urgent. The air was thick with a palpable sense of danger, like something was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, the door opened. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could until I reached the street and the house was out of sight. I didn't know what would happen to me. I didn't know what the box held, what it would do, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that house was still there. I tried to tell myself that I was free, that I had escaped, but the fear lingered. It gnawed at me, deep inside. The house wasn't just haunted by ghosts or restless spirits. It was something darker, something that had been waiting for someone to open the door. And I knew, deep down, that whatever it was, it hadn't finished with me yet. As I walked down the street, the weight of the box in my pocket felt unbearable. I could hear the whispers again, so faint, so distant, but unmistakable. They were calling to me. They were reminding me that I couldn't escape, Not fully. The house had let me go, but it hadn't finished with me. I didn't know if it would ever stop. I didn't know if I would ever be free. And I didn't know who or what would be the next to step across that threshold. I couldn't sleep that night. The house had let me go, but its presence lingered, heavy in the pit of my stomach. The box in my pocket felt like a burden, its weight a constant reminder of the darkness I had disturbed. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself I had escaped, that I could leave it all behind. But the whispers in the back of my mind wouldn't let me. They grew louder every time I closed my eyes. I hadn't told anyone what had happened. Who could I tell? Who would believe me? No one would understand the terror I felt, the suffocating fear that something was following me, waiting for me to slip up. It wasn't just a house. It was something deeper, something that had crawled into my skin, into my very soul. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the box. It lay there, innocuous, almost like an ordinary object, but I knew better. The symbols on it, they weren't just marks. They were warnings, warnings that I had ignored. And now, it felt like they were marking me, too. I had to open it. I had to understand what I had unleashed. I stood up, trembling, my hand hovering over the box. The whispers were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Asterisk, open it. Asterisk, they whispered. Asterisk, understand what you've done. Asterisk. I pulled the box toward me, my fingers trembling as I opened the lid. Inside, there was only one thing, a folded piece of parchment. I unfolded it carefully, and my eyes scanned the words. It was a journal entry, written in the same erratic, jagged handwriting as the last page I'd seen in Henry Caldwell's journal. But these words were different. They were desperate, frantic. Asterisk, I tried to close the door. I thought I could undo it. But now they are here. The house is alive. They are in the walls, in the floors. They are everywhere. I see their faces in the shadows. They know me, and they want me. They are waiting. Asterisk, my hand shook as I continued reading. Asterisk, it was never just a house. The ritual was never about summoning them. It was about opening the door to them. They are not ghosts. They are something else, something that feeds on the living. It is too late to stop them. They will come for you, too. Asterisk, I felt the room grow colder as I read the last words. They will come for you, too. The blood drained from my face. I knew what the journal meant now. The house had always been a portal, a door to something darker than I had imagined. Caldwell had opened it, and I had made the mistake of stepping through. And now, they were coming for me. I slammed the journal shut and shoved the box back into my pocket, my heart racing. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. The whispers were louder now, clearer, like a chorus of voices rising in unison, calling my name. The house, the presence, the thing that had been awakened. It wasn't just after me. It was after anyone who entered that house, and I had no idea how to stop it. A knock at the door. My body went rigid. The sound was soft at first, almost tentative, but unmistakable. Someone was at the door. I stood still, not daring to move. My mind raced. Who could it be? It couldn't be anyone I knew. I hadn't told anyone about what had happened. I hadn't told anyone about the house. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I crept toward the door, my heart thudding in my chest. I hesitated, unsure whether I should open it, but the curiosity, no, the fear, drove me forward. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound, any clue as to who it might be. Nothing. With a shaky hand, I turned the handle and opened the door. There was no one there. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down, expecting to see someone standing on the porch, but the space was empty. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but the street was eerily still. Nothing, just the oppressive silence. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the yard, near the fence, there was a figure, a shadow, standing still in the darkness. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew, instinctively, that it wasn't a person. It was something else. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I saw it move. The figure stretched toward me, the shadows twisting as if it were reaching for me, calling me. I could feel its eyes on me, even from this distance, the weight of its gaze burning into me. I stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't want to look again. I didn't want to see whatever was out there, but I knew it was there. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. And then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from the walls, from the ceiling, from every corner of the house. The sound was relentless, a deafening series of knocks that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The knocking wouldn't stop. It was as if something was trying to break through, trying to come for me. I ran for the stairs, my feet pounding on the hardwood floor, my mind racing. I had to get to the attic. I had to know, whatever was coming, whatever was trying to reach me, I had to face it. I didn't look back as I ran up the stairs, but the knocking followed me. The voices, the whispers, they were all around me now, louder, clearer, as if the house itself were alive, aware of what I had done. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the faintest sound, a laugh, a low, hollow laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached the attic door, hands shaking as I turned the handle. I was too afraid to look behind me, but I knew something was coming. It had already crossed the threshold, and now it was my turn. The door swung open, and the shadows inside the attic seemed to swallow me whole. I stepped into the attic, but I couldn't see anything. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room like living things, writhing and stretching in the dim light. The house creaked around me, the sounds of it groaning, shifting, as though it were trying to tell me something. I could still hear the knocking, the relentless, deafening knocking from downstairs, as though something was desperately trying to break through the walls. I moved deeper into the attic, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every step felt like a mistake, like I was walking deeper into a trap I couldn't escape. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what I had unleashed, even if it meant confronting whatever was waiting for me in the dark corners of this cursed house. The chest. I remembered the chest from before, the one I'd found with the strange symbols and the ancient, rotting parchment inside. It had been the key to understanding Caldwell's obsession, his rituals, and the horrors he'd brought into this world. I had to find it again. Maybe it held the answers I so desperately needed. I felt around in the dark, my hands shaking as they brushed over the dusty floorboards. The silence in the attic was deafening, save for the distant knock, knock, knock from below. The whispers, too, were growing louder, their voices indistinct but filled with a sense of urgency, of something terrible about to happen. And then I found it, the chest. It was tucked into the far corner, almost hidden beneath a pile of old blankets and rotting furniture. The symbols on the lid were faded now, worn down by time, but they still pulsed faintly with an eerie glow, like the remnants of something ancient and powerful. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold, rough wood. The chest felt heavier than it should have been, like it was resisting me, unwilling to be opened. I forced the lid open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, just as before, was the box. But this time, something was different. The box had shifted, moved, as if it had a mind of its own. I pulled it out slowly, my pulse quickening as I examined it. The symbols on the surface of the box were now clearer, more pronounced. They had been etched deeper, like someone or something had been working on them for hours, days, weeks. And then I saw it. The symbol at the center of the box was a circle, with a jagged line running through it, a symbol I recognized from Caldwell's journal. It was a mark used in occult rituals, one that was supposed to be sealed, locked away, never to be opened. But Caldwell had opened it, and now I could hear the knocking again, closer now, almost at my heels. The walls shook with the sound, and I could feel the house trembling beneath me. Something was coming. It was coming for me, for the box, for the door that had been opened. I opened the box. Inside, there was nothing but a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. It was covered in the same markings as the journal entries I had read. Symbols, incantations, and warnings. I could barely make sense of the words, but the one that stood out to me, the one that seemed to glow on the page, was this. Asterisk, the door is open. The price has been paid. Asterisk, the air in the attic turned cold. So cold I could see my breath. The whispers grew louder, frantic, almost panic now. They seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides, filling the space with voices that weren't human, that didn't belong in this world. And then, just as I started to piece together what was happening, I felt it. The air around me shifted, a sudden, powerful force pushing against me. I staggered backward, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing but darkness and shadows. Except for one thing, a figure in the far corner. It was standing still, watching me with eyes that glowed faintly, like coals in a fire. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form seemed to distort and flicker in the dim light, as though it wasn't quite real. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, like the chill of death itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The presence in the room was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The figure spoke, its voice low and guttural, like something ancient, something that had existed before time itself. Asterisk, you opened the door. Asterisk. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to respond. My mind was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of whatever this thing was. I could feel its eyes boring into me, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be completely, utterly helpless. Asterisk, now you belong to us, asterisk. The voice echoed in the room, and I felt something tighten around my chest, like invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows moved, swirling like a living, breathing thing. The knocking was louder now, coming from every direction, the sound of 1,000 hands pounding against the walls, desperate to break through. I fell to my knees, gasping for air, but the pressure was too much. I couldn't breathe. The figure took another step forward, its eyes now so bright they were blinding, and I knew, deep down, that this was it. The door had been opened, and the price had been paid. There was no going back. The last thing I remember is the cold, the crushing weight of the presence, and the sound of the figure's voice, just before everything went black. Asterisk, it's too late, asterisk. When I came to, I wasn't sure where I was. The darkness was suffocating, thicker than before, wrapping around me like a cold, wet blanket. I couldn't move, couldn't see anything, just the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on me. The smell was rancid, like decay, like something long dead had been left to rot in this place. I tried to breathe, but the air was thick and heavy, hard to draw into my lungs. My body felt strange, sluggish, as though I had been lying in one position for days. But when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing, just blackness. I wasn't in the attic anymore. I wasn't in the house at all. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was somewhere else. Somewhere wrong. Panic flooded through me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, cracked, as if I hadn't spoken in days, weeks, months. I tried to move, but my limbs felt unresponsive, like they belonged to someone else. Every inch of me screamed to get up, to run, to escape, but I couldn't. The air was thick with whispers. They surrounded me, brushing against my ears, their words garbled and incomprehensible, yet somehow familiar, like voices I should have recognized, but couldn't quite place. They were speaking in unison, a chorus of thousands, all pushing into my mind at once. I felt their presence, their weight, pressing in on me from every direction. And then, through the haze of fear and confusion, one voice cut through. It was a low, guttural whisper, distinct among the others. Asterisk, you opened the door, asterisk. The voice was familiar. I knew that voice. The figure. The thing from the attic. It was here with me now. The cold washed over me again, more intense this time, like ice water being poured over my skin. I tried to move, tried to push against the cold, but it was like a wall, a force I couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, terrifying hum. My head felt like it was going to split in two, and then I felt it, a touch. Cold fingers brushing against my skin, sending a shock of ice through me. The touch was gentle, like the caress of something that wasn't alive, but it felt wrong. It felt like death. I could feel its presence all around me now, as though it were circling, watching me from the shadows, just out of reach. Asterisk, you thought you could escape. Asterisk, the voice whispered again, this time closer, right in my ear. Asterisk, but there is no escape from us. Not anymore, asterisk. I tried to scream, but my throat was still dry, still unresponsive. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the silence that surrounded me. I was trapped in this place, this void between worlds. The whispers continued, a constant barrage in my mind, but I couldn't focus on them. I couldn't think. My body felt like it was being pulled in 1,000 different directions, each of them painful, each of them tugging at my soul. And then I saw it, a flash, a brief, fleeting glimpse of something moving in the darkness. It was quick, too quick for me to understand, but it was there. Someone was watching me. I tried to move toward it, to reach out, but it was gone, vanished in an instant. I was alone again, but I knew I wasn't. Not really. The presence was still there. I could feel it, its cold, unyielding presence pressing in on me, suffocating me, just out of sight. I could hear its whispers, growing more frantic now, more urgent, as if it were trying to tell me something. Warn me, or perhaps threaten me. I couldn't stay here. I had to escape. I had to find a way out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no escape. The door had been opened. The price had been paid. And now, there was no going back. The cold intensified, and the whispers turned into something darker, something more malevolent. The figure was here, in this space with me. It had never left. It had always been waiting for me to return, waiting for me to pay the price for my curiosity, for my mistake. I tried to move again, but my body felt like lead. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. The cold fingers brushed against me again, this time more insistent, wrapping around my wrist, pulling me toward something. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Feel the darkness, the weight of whatever was coming for me. The figure was closer now, its voice louder, its breath cold against my skin. Asterisk, you belong to us now, asterisk. I tried to scream again, but no sound came. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. When I awoke again, I wasn't sure how long had passed. The place I was in felt different, familiar but distorted. The air was thick, heavier than before, and the whispers had stopped. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't peaceful. No, it was a silence filled with something darker, something worse. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I was aware, but I was trapped, held in place by something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. And then I felt it, a hand, cold and unnatural, brushing against my cheek. Slowly, deliberately. The hand was followed by another, then another, until I felt surrounded. encased in the presence of someone that had no right to be here. A whisper, a voice, asterisk welcome home, asterisk. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that I wasn't in control anymore. I had crossed a threshold I couldn't return from. And the door? It was still open. I couldn't move. Every inch of my body felt as if it had been anchored down by something invisible, something ancient, a force that held me in place and would not let go. My chest heaved in shallow breaths, my heart pounding violently against my ribcage as though it were fighting for freedom. The hand on my cheek was cold, colder than ice, colder than death itself. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break free from whatever nightmare I was trapped in, but my mouth wouldn't open. My throat, dry and cracked, refused to make a sound. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The whispers were all around me again, louder now, urgent. The voices seemed to echo in my mind, overlapping, all speaking at once. Asterisk, you are ours, asterisk. Asterisk, you cannot leave, asterisk. Asterisk, the door is open, and so are you, asterisk. The words seeped into me, like poison, filling my head with an endless storm of torment. I could feel their presence surrounding me, their cold, dark eyes watching me from every corner of this suffocating, twisted place. The hand on my cheek slid downward, brushing across my skin with unnerving gentleness. It traced a line on my jaw, my neck, before resting over my heart. I could feel the ice spreading through me, creeping through my veins, freezing everything it touched, and then slowly it tightened. I wanted to cry out, to fight, to do anything, but I couldn't. The pressure around my chest grew unbearable, as if something was squeezing the very life out of me. My breath hitched in desperate, silent gasps as my lungs burned, unable to draw in enough air. This is it, I thought. Asterisk, I'm going to die here. Trapped forever in this place, asterisk. The grip loosened, but only slightly. A chill, sharper than before, rushed over me as I felt something move in the dark. Something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't be. I was aware of every minute detail. The dust settling in the still air, the faint flicker of something moving in the corner of my vision, the sound of creaking floorboards beneath me, as if the house itself was alive, shifting, breathing. It felt like I was no longer in the attic, or any room I had ever known. This wasn't the house. This was something else, something worse. This was a place that existed between worlds, where nothing made sense, where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred. I wanted to close my eyes and pretend it wasn't happening. But even in the darkness, I could feel the presence of the figure, watching me, waiting for me to break, to beg. I could feel its breath on my neck now, cold and fetid, like the stink of rot and decay. Its fingers tightened around my wrists, pulling me up, dragging me toward something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. I could feel it. I could feel its hunger, its insatiable need. The figure leaned in, and I felt its presence more intensely than ever before. Its voice, barely a whisper, echoed in my mind, but it wasn't just speaking to me. Asterisk, you have opened the door, asterisk, it said. The words reverberated, as though they were coming from within my own head, from the depths of my soul. Asterisk, and now you will walk through it. You will walk through it for us. We are here. We are waiting. And we will never let you leave, asterisk. The pressure around my chest grew stronger, colder, until I thought I would snap in half. I fought with everything I had, every ounce of strength in my body, but it was useless. I couldn't escape. And then, just as I thought I was about to be consumed completely, something inside me, some deep, primal instinct, flickered awake. It was fear. It was will. The remnants of who I used to be. The person who had once believed in the mundane in reality, fought back, even as it felt like I was losing everything that made me human. I opened my eyes, or at least I tried to. The darkness swirled around me, like a storm that refused to clear, but I could see something just beyond the edge of my vision, a faint glow. It was small, weak, but it was there. The box, it was still with me, somewhere in the dark, in the void. The box, the object that had started this whole nightmare, the key to everything. I reached for it with every ounce of strength I could muster, my fingers twitching as they sought it out. The whispers around me grew louder, angrier, as if they knew what I was doing, as if they were trying to stop me. But I wasn't going to give up. I grasped it. The cold was overwhelming, but there was something else now, something different, a warmth, flickering at the edge of my consciousness. The box, the symbols, the door, and then the whisper stopped. The cold fingers released their grip on me, and the suffocating pressure around my chest loosened. For a moment, I thought I had broken free, that I had somehow outwitted whatever force was holding me. But then I heard it, a sound that cut through the silence, a sound that made my blood freeze. The sound of something moving, something that had been waiting for me. Slowly, I turned my head, my heart racing, my breath shallow and erratic. The darkness shifted in front of me, coalescing into something or someone. I saw the outline of a figure, tall and unnatural, its form barely visible through the shadows. Its eyes glowed like the embers of a fire that would never burn out. Its mouth twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was something worse, something malevolent. The figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it didn't belong in this world. Asterisk, you have opened the door. Asterisk, it repeated. Its voice was a guttural whisper, full of cold, hollow malice. Asterisk, but it is not you who decides when it closes. Asterisk. The figure moved closer, and I could feel its presence enveloping me, pressing in from every direction, its eyes fixed on mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. And then, just as I thought it would reach out and claim me, something shifted. A crack, a small but noticeable crack. The figure paused, its expression changing, its smile faltering just for a moment. And I realized with sudden clarity that I had made a mistake. I had thought that it was me who was trapped here. But maybe, just maybe, it was them who were truly trapped. Maybe the door wasn't something that just opened. It was something that could be closed. If I had the will, if I could push back hard enough. I couldn't give up now, not after everything I'd been through. I reached into the shadows, grabbing the box with trembling fingers. And I knew this wasn't over yet. I had to make a choice, and it would either save me or damn me forever. The figure loomed over me, its eyes glowing brighter, its form more solid now, as though it had fully materialized from the shadows. I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight, suffocating and cold. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape. But I was paralyzed, locked in place by fear, by the terrible realization that there was nowhere to hide. Asterisk, you cannot escape. Asterisk, the figure whispered again, its voice colder now, almost mocking. Asterisk, you thought you could close the door, but the door has already claimed you. Asterisk. I could feel it, its power, its hunger, swirling around me. It was drawing closer, step by agonizing step. And yet, even as its voice rattled in my mind, another thought rose within me, a thought that refused to be drowned out by the terror, by the coldness that seeped into my bones. The box. I gripped it tighter, my fingers shaking as I ran them over the intricate symbols on its surface. The markings seemed to shift beneath my touch, as if they were alive, breathing. It pulsed with a strange, unnatural energy, but there was something else too, something different. It wasn't just a key to this nightmare. It was a key to something more, something deeper. For the first time I understood, the box was never just a tool for summoning. It was a prison. It was the anchor, the only thing that could hold whatever was haunting me at bay. The figure stopped. Its eyes widened just slightly, as though it sensed what I was realizing. Asterisk, no. Asterisk, it hissed, the sound low and venomous. Asterisk, you do not understand. You cannot stop this. You cannot close it. The door is open. Forever, asterisk. But the longer I held the box, the stronger the pull became. The whispers were growing fainter now, as though they were retreating into the shadows. The figure's presence was waning, the one solid form starting to flicker and distort, as though it were made of smoke. I forced myself to focus, to block out the panic and the voices. I wasn't going to let it consume me, not after everything I'd endured. I knew what I had to do, even if I wasn't entirely sure how. With trembling hands, I pressed the box's lid firmly shut. The symbols glowed brighter, pulsing with a powerful energy. I could feel it. This wasn't just a box anymore. It was a seal, a binding force. The door, the one I had opened so recklessly, was closing. The very air around me seemed to hum, to vibrate with the force of the box's power. The figure screeched, a high-pitched wail that tore at my eardrums, its form beginning to break apart. It was no longer solid, no longer in control. It was panicking. It was fading. Asterisk, you cannot do this. Asterisk, it cried, its voice a mix of rage and fear. Asterisk, you cannot close what is already opened. Asterisk. I didn't know if I had enough power, if I could push it back far enough, but I had to try. I had to fight, with every last bit of strength in me. I slammed the box down on the ground, the force sending a shock through the room. The very floor beneath me seemed to tremble in response, as though the house itself were rebelling, trying to prevent the seal from being completed. But it was too late. The whispers vanished. The figure dissolved, its presence evaporating like smoke, leaving behind only silence. Deep, absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows the end of a storm. The kind that fills you with dread, but also with relief. The air around me shifted. The cold began to lift. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating me fading away like a fading memory. I was alone again. The house was still, too still. I wasn't sure what had just happened. I wasn't sure if I had truly stopped whatever had been trying to claim me. But one thing was certain. The door had closed. Or so I thought, for the briefest moment. As I stood in the silence, trying to collect my thoughts, I heard it. A whisper, a soft, familiar voice that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure once more. It was still distorted, still flickering between forms, but it was there, waiting, watching. And the door? It was wide open again. I froze. My hand instinctively reached for the box, but it was gone. The box had vanished along with the figure. It was like the house had swallowed it whole. And then I realized, with a sickening twist in my stomach, that the door had never really closed. Not truly. I had sealed the box, but the thing inside it, the thing that had once been trapped, was still out there, waiting. Asterisk, you think you can escape this, asterisk, the figure said, its voice now thick with amusement. Asterisk, but you're wrong. The door is open, and it will always be open. There is no end to this asterisk. I could feel the pull, the draw of whatever it was. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but I couldn't. I knew, deep down, that it was inevitable. The house was alive with it, alive with them. I turned and fled, not looking back, but I could hear it, the sounds following me, getting closer. I could hear the knocking again, louder than before. The whispers filled the air, growing louder, more insistent. The footsteps behind me were unmistakable. I burst through the door, into the hall, into the daylight, into the world outside. But even as I ran, I could feel it, the presence. The weight of what I had unleashed was still there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the next person to come along, the next soul to cross the threshold. And I knew deep down that I hadn't really escaped. The door was always open, always waiting, and I would never be free. I glanced behind me one last time, but the house was empty, silent, but somewhere deep inside, I could still hear it. The knocking, the whispers, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it called to someone else. Before the door opened again, and the cycle would begin anew.